Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. He seeks vengeance? Aegon asked. Against us all, but your family most of all. Quentyn said, I'll see you say your goodbyes to your sister. Your suffering will end this night. Aegon said as he rose. He moved towards them and told her to seek answers once the meeting was done. But for now she was to join him and the queen as they spoke to the Dornish lords. She followed after Sir Jaime and the king, walking through the halls until they reached the large room where the meeting was to be held. The queen sat with Princess Arianne, her dragon guard behind her, and her unsullied close by. Melora saw the quick look she gave the king and the nod he gave her back before he took his seat beside her. Princess Arianne rose once Aegon was seated, and Melora looked out at the Dornish lords and ladies as they began to quieten down. She could see some of the looks that were directed at the king were unfavorable, and while the queen got some of those very same looks, there were far less of them aimed her way. Melora wasn't the only one looking at the expressions either, as when she turned to look at the king, she saw him taking note of every single person who looked his and his queen's way. My lord, my ladies, Sunspear is back in our hands once more, and Dorne remains unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. Princess Arianne said to loud cheers. My brother is of Dorne, he knows how Dorne works, and what way we'd respond to an army of foreign invaders, and yet, he chose to bring them to our shores regardless. He chose to take this city for himself, and to try and not only usurp my position as your princess, but your will in naming me so. He has paid for this treachery, my lords and ladies, and he has paid dearly. Maester Caleote and Maester Miles have ensured me that he will not last the night. She could see this was news to some, and she knew the king hadn't spoken to the princess yet. Melora looking to the queen and realizing that it was her that had relayed the news while Aegon was with her and Quentyn. It brought a smile to her face to know they were sharing such things with each other and that Quentyn's fate had been decided by them both even before the king had made his way to see him. We did not do this alone, and were it not for their graces, then far more Dornish lives would have been lost in taking back this city. Far more damage would have been done to Sunspear, to the old palace, and to Dorne itself, were it not for her grace, Queen Daenerys Targaryen and his grace King Aegon. Arianne said this time to at first a decent cheer for the queen, and both a muted one, and then some hisses for the king. Enough. Dorne takes no issue with his grace's birth. Arianne said, and loudly, though it was clear it took issue with something else, something that was about to be laid out. Parley was broken. A flag of truce was ignored. How is Dorne to trust such a man? It wasn't the princess who answered, or even the king. The queen, instead, standing up and glaring out at the assembled lords and ladies. Such a man is your king. You speak of him with respect, lest you incur my anger and face my wrath. The queen said, her voice firm and strong. Parley was broken, that's true, but then you of Dorne know all about breaking Parley, do you not? The queen said, glaring at those in the room. That was different. Daeron tried to subjugate us. He was a tyrant. She watched as the queen let the voices shout out their grievances and objections to what she had said. Melora then looking at the king and again seeing he was taking note of each and every man who spoke. Be careful, then, that you don't turn my husband and me into tyrants, my lords, my ladies, for if we wished to subjugate Dorne, we could do it far easier than our ancestors did, and to far greater effect, the queen said to hushed whispers. Prince Quentyn came to the parley with hostages, with the intent of forcing us to accept him over Dorne's rightful ruler. He even offered to give up the city were we to give him his sister's head. Death of family sought at someone else's hands is still kinslaying, is it not? Her grace speaks true. Speak to Lord Dane, Lord Yarwood, or Sir Daemon of my brother's intent. Speak to them and call what was done a breaking of parley on their grace's side, Princess Arianne said. It was then the king stood up, Aegon looking out on each of the lords and ladies, his eyes more like ice than fire, until he spoke. I care not for Dorne just as it cares not for me. You'll kneel willingly and with good cheer, and you'll be welcomed into our kingdom. Do not try to agitate or seek to be a land alone. For it won't be with a wedding that will bring Dorne to heel. It'll be with fire and blood instead. For those of you who wish to learn just what that looks like, I ask you to look to the north. Look to the army that came to make you kneel to their false prince. Look to them and see what happens when you find our disfavor. The king stopped speaking for a moment to let the words sink in. Melora, seeing the angry looks, now replaced with far more worried ones. If they thought Aegon dishonorable, then they were right to fear him, and since he had no love here, fear it would be that he'd leave them with. On our way to take back this city, this palace, and Dorne itself, we found that the army that Prince Quentyn brought to your lands was here no more. Instead, it has set sail for the lands of my mother, my uncles, and my cousins. It seeks to attack men and women who, unlike those of Dorne, other than Lord Dane and his men, fought side by side with my wife and me against an army that sought to end us all of us, my lords, my ladies, not just me, my wife and those we cared about, all of us. Yet my wife and I stayed here to see your princess return to the seat that belonged to her by right of blood and law. We ended a fight with few losses of life against a man with no honor, no care for who he harmed, and a man who sought the death of his own sister. We stayed, and Dorne is free once more, unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. As Princess Arianne rightly says, but be in no doubt, my lords, my ladies, it remains so only because we choose it to be. Only because my wife and I are not tyrants. If we were, then what is to be done to the army that threatens the north should serve as fair warning as to what we are able to do to you or to any who name us such. The king sat down, and the whispers spoken in the room were very different. The looks far more fearful, and she saw him whisper to the queen before he nodded to her and got up from his seat. She, the king, and Sagranet all walked from the room, and she readied to look and find answers to the questions that she was soon to be asked. The stony shore. Theon. Many years earlier he'd landed here, leading his own ships and his own men, and seeking to take these lands for himself. He'd been a different man then, a fuller man, and it had been the greatest mistake of his life to land on these shores. No, a voice in his head said, your greatest mistake was to not sail back to Robb, to not warn him, to not die by his side if need be. Theon barely recognized that voice as the younger man he had once been. Try as he might, he couldn't get it through to her. She wouldn't listen, and had gone so far as to all but name him a fool. Melakol was her kin by marriage. A man who'd finally taken her side and would see her return to her rightful place. The words she spoke, as foolish as she claimed him to be, as it was clear that this man cared not for Sansa, for him, or for anything but the same things that Theon had once sought here, vengeance and power. He'd been a fool then, seeking something he truly didn't believe in, and something he was ill-equipped to wield, and it had cost him greatly. Each day he spent in Melakol's or his men's company, he felt Sansa came closer to paying as harsh a price as he once had. The man himself may be enough of a mummer to let her believe his words, and his closest guards and captains may understand the need for such mummery and be able to play along. Those lower down did not and could not. They spoke of conquest, of bringing the north to heel, and not once did they mention Sansa when they did so. It wasn't her they'd come for, they hadn't even known about her and had come across them simply by chance. Something she couldn't understand, no matter how many times he said it to her. They were coming here, regardless, Sansa. They were heading north, regardless, Theon said. Malako said as much. They sought allies and were seeking us out at Winterfell. Sansa said, and he shook his head. He didn't even know of you, Sansa, of Winterfell, or of what had happened there, so why would he be going there if he didn't know anything of the place? He said, and she laughed at him, and then looked at him as if he was a child. He knew we were from Winterfell, Theon, that it belonged to the Starks, she said, almost rolling her eyes at him. Winterfell had fallen, Sansa, he said. He knew of Rose Bolton and that he'd not stopped off anywhere before he met us. So how did he know it was back in the hands of the Starks? How did he know that Jon had taken it back? I took it back, me. It was me that the Knights of the Vale rode for, not Jon. He'd lost the Battle of the Bastards, and it was only won because of me, she said angrily. But how did Malako know? He said, and she refused to speak to him, instead walking away from him in a huff, and she looked very much like the girl he remembered then, the spoiled girl who never gave him any time. If she could help it. It took almost a week to get every man, horse, and their supplies off the ships. A week in which she spoke to him only twice, and only the second time because he played into her own view of things. She'd spoken to Malako, she said. Spoken to him, and he'd told her that it was true he'd not known they'd taken back Winterfell, but he had known that Rose Bolton had played his part in the Red Wedding. So yes, he'd sought vengeance, and he sought vengeance still. And with him by her side, then she'd get her own vengeance too. Nothing that Theon could say to her got through, And so each night they feasted, and she sat by Malika's side, while the man pumped her for information about the North and its lords, or about Winterfell's defenses. He would hear her say that the garrison there was small, and that once they saw she was with them, they'd open the gates and welcome them inside. Theon, trying his best not to shake his head and show how false that line of thinking was. It was as they began to march that he tried once more time, as they were traveling through the rills, that he made one last effort to make her see sense. Only to find that once again she had no desire to listen to what he said, and that he had only raised her ire at him. To hear her tell him that he was just like Jon and Daenerys, that he too wished to see her denied what was rightfully hers, was something he couldn't believe. No amount of pleading, of telling her that this would not end how she wished, would be listened to, and the only thing it had led to was him now having guards assigned to him. For his own protection, Malako had said, and even though he could see that Sansa knew it was for anything but, she said nothing. Even though she knew better than any how he may feel about being a prisoner once more. She had helped him not, and so he made his choice, and he cursed her for it. "I need to take a piss," he said as they rode through the Barrowlands. "Then piss," one of the guards said, laughing at him. "I'm stopping, you can stop with me. Or you can fucking ride on," he said angrily, and the two guards glared at him before giving in to his request. They were near the beginnings of the Wolfswood lands that he knew well, and when they stopped near a small stream, he quickly moved behind the tree, to make it seem as if he was doing what he had said. He knew these lands not as well as he once had, but he knew them, and while the army was bypassing the keeps, to keep their mummery up, no doubt, it was adding time to their march. Time that he would make use of, he thought, as he bent down and picked up the stone in his hands. The two guards had taken the opportunity to stretch their legs and were complaining about the cold. Theon listening as they spoke, as if the sun didn't exist in these lands, and of how much they wished they were back in their own. He moved quietly, hoping the horses wouldn't give him away, and when he saw the bow on one of them, he knew it was that one he needed to take. Mounting quickly, he threw the stones at the other two horses, driving them off, and then he was racing through the Wolfswood. There was no looking back, no stopping or slowing down. Theon instead using the paths and trails to his advantage. A part of him felt as bad as he had when he had betrayed Robb, and though he believed he was leaving Sansa to face some harsh treatment, he knew he had no choice. He'd done his best to get through to her, and while he hadn't much to live for, if he was to die then it would be for something he believed in, and not for a lie. He hoped they'd listen to him, and that they'd make ready. He prayed that Jon and Daenerys would come, and should they seek to take his head once they did, then he'd accept their sentence. Euron Greyjoy could not save Sansa Stark, not from Makro and not from herself. He hoped that his leaving would at least give Jon a chance to do what he could not, and when he faced Robb again, he hoped he'd understand. Sunspear 305 AC. Euden! Dany had set them right, and he'd made the threat. Between them they'd leave Dorne in no doubt where they stood. He knew that right now she was smoothing over his words, making it clear it was a threat he made. A promise, but not one that either of them wished to have to carry out. Between his wife and Princess Arianne, Ned Dane, and Ser Daemon, they could do what he could not and smooth over the feathers he'd ruffled. He had no time for such things, his own needs and the needs of the North, outweighing the needs of prickly Dornishmen and women. So Hygieia and Melora walked to her room, and as he sat in the corner and looked to Jaime, they waited for her to tell him all he needed to know. It took far longer than he had hoped, and by the time he made it back to his and Dany's room, she'd already taken to their bed. Aegon moving to the balcony to speak to Lyrax before undressing and joining her. "Aegon?" she said softly, when she felt him climb into the bed beside her. "Jaime, sleep, we'll speak on the morrow," he said, and kissed her cheek, glad when she drifted back to sleep, even if it left him awake and alone with his thoughts. He wanted her to go back to King's Landing to be safe and in comfort, while he went and dealt with Malakwana Bajor and the threat he posed. The North had been mobilized. Lady Marjorie and Lord Wyman were on the march, and more would follow, but it wouldn't be men that put paid to this threat. It would take the dragons to do so, and Bajor and felt that he and Raoul could manage it alone, and that Dangery and Drogon wouldn't be needed. He knew she'd not agree. Even Lyrax didn't agree. And he'd barely told the Red Dragon of his plans. She'd just known of them and was adamant that she too would fly north. There was no point in arguing with a stubborn dragon he'd found and compared to his wife, Lyrax. Dangery, he knew wouldn't even allow him to consider going without her. As he felt his eyes grow heavy, he began to smile. Perhaps it was for the best that he'd been left alone with his thoughts after all. It would mean that when he awoke on the morrow, it would not be to the argument he'd assumed he'd be having. She'd come with him no matter what he said. Far better he not even suggest otherwise, he thought as finally drifted off to sleep. His dreams were filled with dragon fire, with flames being laid down and of men being covered by them. It was different. Hearing screams from the living was so very different than hearing none from the dead. Yet he felt these men deserved it, that it would need to be done. They'd not retreat and not surrender. Not with Malako leading them. Vengeance was a cruel mistress, and one that demanded her do no matter what. And though Malako's blame was misplaced, only death would free him of his need to see his mistress sated. So death was what he'd bring him, death and an eternity of nothing at all. "Aegon, wake up," he heard Dany say loudly, feeling her arms as she pushed him and shook him awake. What time is it?" he said, rubbing his eyes as the light hit them. "It's early. We must speak," Aegon. His wife said, and he turned to look at her. Dany sitting up in their bed with her back resting against the pillows. "Must we?" he said with a smirk as he took his own pillow and covered his head with it, hearing both her little giggle and then her annoyed snort. "We must," she said, grabbing the pillow from him and throwing it to the floor. A satisfied look on her face until he reached for one of hers, and then he laughed when her eyebrow rose and she glared at him, daring him to try and take it from her. "I'm up," he said, sitting up and trying not to roll his eyes at her pleased look as she celebrated her little victory. "Dorne is on our side," she said proudly, and he looked at her before kissing her cheek. "Even after what I said," he asked. "It worked. They fear us, but there's more. They respect us too. I dare say they'll love us in time," she said, and he looked at her curiously. "You perhaps," he said, and she shook her head. "Us," she said firmly, as she explained that though his words caused fear, it had another effect. They were looking to the north now and thinking about what they were both about to do. Dany emphasizing both just in case he was in any doubt she'd be coming with him. "Melora says they march and have far more men than the north can face. 3 times the number and far better equipped. We must fly, Dany. Without the dragons, the north will fall," he said, and she reached out and took his hand, holding it tight in her own as she nodded. "There is no time for the army to sail, is there?" she asked, and he shook his head. "Perily," and he shook it again. "We need to send a message, a loud one, to Dorne and to Essos too. When we're done, it'll be this they speak of, and not how we took Sunspear. And even if they still do, then it'll be with this clear in their minds," he said, and she looked at him, willing him to kiss her with her eyes. And Aegon, unable to resist doing as she bid, they rose together, dressing quickly and calling their men to ready for the return. Yaxon asked Valora to speak to Davos and to Arya, while Dany did the same to Grey Worm in relation to Missandei. After they broke their fast, they met with Princess Arianne and took her true oath of fealty. Dorne was now officially back as a true member of the Seven Kingdoms, and the princess swore that they had won her to their side. Quentyn had passed during the night, and despite what he had done, he would be given a funeral fit for a prince. Arianne telling them that she'd keep an eye on the lords and ladies, and that should any show any true doubt, then she'd set them right. The ships would be ready to leave by the morrow, their men leaving Dorne and heading back to King's Landing, though Aegon knew that both they and Ye wished to be sailing to the east instead. It was that which he knew would be Malako's undoing. His taking her from what she wished to do would be met with a far more deadly response than even the one that he was planning. By the time they were finished in the north, she'd be unable to travel, the babe would be too close to being born, and so her people in Meereen would have longer to wait for their queen's return. It was because of this that he almost pitied Malako for what he was about to bring down upon himself, almost. They said their goodbyes to the princess and to Ser Daemon, to Ned Dane, and to Ned's aunt Illyria, who he'd met only briefly. After telling Grey Worm, Quano, and Melora that they'd return as soon as their work in the north was done, Aegon, Tormund, and Yaem climbed up on Rhaegar's back, and Dany, Jorah, and Brienne did the same on Drogon's. With a nod to each other, they took to the sky, and Aegon looked to Lyraix as she flew in front of them, the red dragon eager to fly with her brothers and with Dany and him. She was eager to see the north and to bring their enemies fire and blood. Winterfell 3005, Dolorous Ed, Running a keep was not the same as being Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and all he could do was hope it didn't end the same way. He'd been stunned when Jon asked him to take the responsibility, even more so when he told them what he wished to do for him if the time came for him to leave Winterfell. If, not when, not certainly if, that alone was a strange enough thought, as he'd listened to Jon explain it to him. I need someone I can trust here, Ed. There are few of those in this world. There are some who I'd counted on completely, who I've since found out were never on my side. Jon said, his voice sounding tired. I'm on your side, Jon, he said, more cheerily than he usually did, as he had decided to be not so dour just so Jon knew he was being true. Of course being on your side usually leads to the world turning to shit, and me doing things I don't want to, he added. And it will again, my friend, Jon said, laughing, as he reached out to pat his back. I need you to be the Castellan here, Ed. Your sisters? He said, shaking his head. Sansa is one of those I can no longer trust, and Arya, one day this may be her path, but for now, at least, it's not what she wants. One of the lords or ladies, Jon, the Marmin, or the She-Bear, he said, trying to talk himself out of the position, weren't with me at Hardhome. They didn't stand guard over my body or bring the free folk to arms against Thorne and the traitors. You're my brother, Ed, a true as one as Gren or Pipe was, as Robb was, Jon said, his voice trailing off. A poor brother you were left with, Jon, he said softly, as Jon shook his head. One I'm most grateful for, Ed. You, Chairman, Davos, Dany, there are others too, or will be, I hope, but you're the only ones I trust completely. You've no idea how much it means to me that I can, Ed. I've been betrayed by so many people. You've no idea how much it means to me. I thank you for that. Jon said. Jon had then explained that he was to run Winterfell as if it was his own. He'd get help from Lord Wyman, Lady Meg, and others, but he was the acting lord of it, of Wintertown, and of its lands. If the time came when there was another to take the responsibility from him, then he could or would be given his own keep and lands, or there would always be a place and a role for him by Jon's side. Get married, Ed, find a woman to share your bed and life with. Life is too fucking short, and we've both known far too much of its worst parts. Find some of the good, and Ed, don't knock it down when I'm gone, Jon said. The two of them laughing before embracing, a different feeling within him than when last they'd done so. Despite his unsuitability and nervousness about running something as large as Winterfell, he'd found that he was far better at it than he'd feared. He'd at first fell into the same routine he had at Castle Black. He'd set people to tasks, rebuilding, seeing the stores were full, and making lists. Gods, he fucking hated lists. His life had been full of lists when he was a steward, but at least then it had only been his own lists. Now it was everyone else's, and he would spend hours going over them. The smithy needed more iron, more wood, and a fucking new smith. The stables needed a master of horse, cooks he had plenty of, and the one thing he couldn't grumble about was that the food was good. Not as good as the ale, though. Winterfell had its own ale master, and unlike that fucking piss they'd brewed at Castle Black, that each and every single black brother had said the same thing about it at one time or another. This was done right. For thousands of years, the Night's Watch had existed for, and in all that time, they still made the worst fucking ale in Westeros. After a brief settling-in period, his days became a routine. Ed finding he had a knack for organizing things, especially when he wasn't worried about an army of dead men marching towards him. He appointed the last few black brothers to positions that suited them. Darnus and Evan took over Winterfell's guard, and Cale basically served as his own steward and thereby the keeps. Stocks-wise, they were well set, with at least a year, maybe even two, of supplies for them, and Wintertown, though some of those would also be needed to be sent out to some of the other towns, villages, and keeps of the north. He'd even found a woman, as Jon had suggested. Josie was a bastard from Wintertown, who'd come looking for work, and who he'd hit it off with. They'd not done much, but they'd spent time together, and when he looked at her, he could see the beginnings of a future. Something he'd not ever expected to have. He found himself almost chuckling when he was alone, and he thought about how he'd ended up in the Night's Watch. You're an ugly fucker, lad, but women love men in uniform, even a dour cunt like you, Ewern said. And free food and ale, you say. Ale you can drink. You'll need to put in some work too, lad, but you'll not go to be hungry or thirsty. On that you have my word, Ewern said. He had to give it to the man. Other than his fucking lie about women, he'd never been hungry or thirsty in his time at the Night's Watch. And so what if he'd been a fool who didn't understand what celibacy meant? A vow was a vow, and he was more than willing to swear one about a word he didn't understand. It was only after he'd done so that he realized that the gods loved to fuck with Edison Tollet and would do so regularly. As the weeks passed and Winterfell began to look like a keep that hadn't been attacked by an army of dead men, things with him and Josie developed, and he'd asked her to be his wife. He was surprised when she agreed to it, though he really shouldn't have been, as Keel had told him he was a catch now. He'd have thought he was set for a boring life, and perhaps he was, until the damned raven came, that showed he was still the same unlucky bastard he'd always been. "My lord, a raven bearing the king's seal," Wolkan said as he handed him the raven. The three-headed dragon standing proud, Ed broke the seal and read it quickly, his shocked look worrying the maester. "My lord? An army marches our way, master. We must make Winterfell ready to meet them," he said, and the master hurried from the room. As the days stretched into a week and then two, Ed readied the keep to withstand a siege. He sent out scouts to look for any sign of an army marching their way, and sent word to Wintertown for the people to move into the keep. Then he waited, and he waited, his nights spent not in his bed with Josie, but instead standing on the battlements and looking out on the night sky, waiting. What he was waiting for was something that he'd spent many of the past years waiting for. A sense of peace and calm that only came when he knew his friend was to fight by his side. When Jon had ridden out from the gates of Castle Black to head to Winterfell, there had been a small part of Ed that believed he'd never see him again, despite the fact he'd come back from being taken prisoner by the free folk all those years earlier, from Hardhome and even from death itself. When he'd watched him leave, he'd thought him gone forever. Later, when the wall fell and the dead marched and he'd run for his life, he believed it even more so. At Last Hearth, when he'd joined up with Tormund and Beric and they'd ridden to Winterfell, a part of him was certain he'd not be there when he got there. Yet each time he'd found that he did return, that he didn't abandon them, and so he believed it would be the same now. Jon would come, and together they'd fight and throw back these fools who dared to threaten his home, for it was his now as much as it was any of the men, women, and children who'd named it such. These were his people, under his protection, and he would see them and Josie safe. He had readied it for what was to come. Now he just waited for the man to lead them through the battles as he always had. "A rider! A rider approaches!" He heard a guard shout out, and for a moment he looked to the sky, thinking that would be where Jon rode now. Instead, it was at the gates, and so he made his way down the steps. He walked out into the courtyard to look on as his guards led Theon Greyjoy to where he stood. "I need to speak to you, Jon." Theon said, his voice almost breathless, and Ed thought he looked almost dead on his feet. "His Grace is not here." "What brings you here, Greyjoy? You were exiled, were you not?" he said, his own voice far more lordly than he'd known it to be. An army marches our way. More than 20,000 men, I believe." Theon said before collapsing. "Get him inside, feed him and place him in a room, put some guards on the door. We'll speak on the morrow." The men did as he said, and Ed made his way to his own room, opening the door quietly once he got there. His intent was to sneak into his bed and not wake her. As in most things in his life, though luck was not on his side. "Ed," Josie said sleepily. "Go back to sleep, my love," he said, kissing her softly, and then watching as she did so. He undressed and climbed into the bed beside her, his arms going around her as he held her close and tried to find some sleep. "Jon will return, he always does," he said in almost a whisper as his eyes finally closed and he drifted off to sleep. Summerhall 305 AC. Jaime Lannister. It had looked like an abandoned, broken-down keep when they'd landed the night before. Just another remnant of a war long since past, and so he'd not given it any mind. Not even when he and Brienne had been sent inside to make sure there was no one nearby or hiding within its walls, had he given it much thought. True, it had been strange when the king, queen, and the red dragon had bid them all stay by the fire and eat their meal while they walked through the abandoned keep. Then again, things they both did at times were strange to him. The king was so different to the boy he'd met all those years ago, confident, collected, and calculating. These were not things he'd have said about Jon Snow, about Aegon Targaryen. He'd say those and many others. The king was a dragon far more than a wolf, and was ruthless too when he needed to be. Yet it was an honest ruthlessness, and not anything like how his grandfather's was tinged with madness, or how Jaime's own father's was tinged with a desire to be feared. Aegon's was a necessary ruthlessness, and a protective one. It was one that was most welcomed by Ser Jorah, in particular, as it focused on making sure the queen was safe above anything else. He'd been amazed when the king had told them all what he intended to do with the Dornish. He and Brienne both bringing up how the breaking of parley may be seen. Yet they'd not dissuaded him, and instead he'd simply explained to them the tale of the young dragon and what was done to him in the Dornish sands. He'd said they had other battles to fight, other wars to win, and better it cost him his reputation than men their lives. That almost alone would have been enough to convince him that he was very different from how his father had been. Tywin Lannister was not afraid to throw men at a problem, and he cared not if he lost them. "Will we lose our men?" Jaime asked. "We have reserves, do we not?" his father said. No, in that respect, and so many others, Aegon was a different sort. The Queen, too, as Jorah wasn't shy to mention, the Bear Knight telling him tales of what they'd done in Essos, and of how the people had felt about their queen there, their Messa, their mother. It had helped him deal with his own losses, too. For he feared Tyrion had fallen. As smart and clever as his brother was, he was a dwarf alone in the world, and Jaime feared he'd met his end just as Cersei had, as his children had. He was the last of Tywin Lannister's Lions of the Rock, and he would die the last of them, it seemed. This was who he was supposed to be. Dragon Guard to a good king and queen, to rulers he respected and wished to serve. Dragon Guard with true knights beside him, ones he was more than happy to serve beside and who he'd found in Brienne and Jorah. That it would be them to rebuild and remake the order gave him a sense of comfort he'd not known in many a year. Good and true, they'd find them and cloak them as members of the Dragon Guard. They spoke, ate, and when the king, queen, and Red Dragon came back and took their seats, Jaime relaxed as he watched them both. Aegon and Daenerys sat and laughed and japed, the king sitting behind the queen with his arms around her protectively as she shared some words with Brienne and Jorah, and the king spoke softly to the Red Dragon and to Tormund. He caught his eye and saw the small nod and smile the king gave him, Jaime returning it and then taking to his bed. Brienne and the dragons would take the first shift, though he himself wouldn't truly sleep tonight, or so he thought, only for sleep to come, and the dreams to follow. He sat by the tree, his eyes closed, and he heard the footsteps as they approached. There was more than one coming his way, and his hand moved to his sword. "It's your sword I want, Jaime," the voice said, and he opened his eyes to see them standing there. Prince Lywin looked as tanned and fierce as he remembered him. Jonathan looked resolute. Oswald had a smirk on his face, while the bold and the white bull looked like they'd been carved in stone, their features implacable and unmoving. Arthur wore a full smile, and Jaime looked to see Don's blade resting on his shoulder. "It's your sword I want, Jaime," Arthur said with a chuckle. "Then you shall have it, Sari," he said, smiling back. He watched as they parted, as they formed an honor guard, Lowen, Jonathan, and Oswald on one side, and Barristan, Gerald, and Arthur on the other. Jaime rubbed his eyes and swore he saw them in the distance, the young girl chasing after the black cat, the babe held in his mother's arms, the young woman riding on a horse, as she laughed, and then he saw him walking towards him, his silver prince, the man he so wished to serve and see crowned as his king. "I told you things would change when I returned, Sir Jaime. Little did even I know just how much," Rosier said. "My prince," he said softly. "You are a good man, and true. Jaime, I deem your oath to be followed, and on behalf of your brothers and myself, I thank you. Look after them, Jaime. Look after my family, as you are and have been doing, and know that you have my and your brother's gratitude for doing so." Rogergar said as he began to fade away. Roger, Ilya, Rushes, and Aegon, Lyanna, and then Lywin, Jonathan, Oswald, and Gerald, Barristan, and finally Arthur. "Arthur, don't please," he cried out. "I named you a knight, Jaime. It was the truest thing I have ever done. You have become me, and the smiling knight is finally dead where he belongs," Arthur said as he faded away. Jackson woke up in tears and moved away from the fire, which had long since burned out. He shook his head at Jera, who was on watch, and soon found himself on a hill overlooking the broken-down keep. His tear-filled eyes made it look as if it stood once more, and Jaime found himself shaking his head and wiping his eyes as he finally realized where he was. Summerhall, they'd come to Summerhall, and he dropped down to his knees, almost striking out when he felt the hand on his shoulder. "You dreamt of them too?" Aegon asked, and Jaime looked at him to see if he was jesting before he then nodded his head. "The dragons wished to come here once they felt it, Regier, Drogon, Liarik. They all wished to come here, and once I told Dany where here was. She wished it too." Aegon said, sitting down beside him. I saw my brothers, I saw your father, your family," he said, his voice shaky. I saw my father, Shaimi, my mother, and my brother and sister. I saw their mother and spoke to them as I'm speaking to you now. Dany spoke to her mother. For the first time in her life, she spoke to her mother. And though I wish to be with my wife, it's not my comfort she seeks right now, Aegon said. I don't understand. How could we? He asked. The world is a strange place and one I've long since given up trying to understand. I died, and yet I live and am soon to be a father. My heart stopped beating, and yet it beats for the first time for true now. We could sit here and try and make sense of things, or we could accept the gift we were given. What was said to me, it comforted me. It trues in the words you hear comfort. You too? Aegon asked, and Jaime took a while to answer. They did more than any I've ever heard, he said. Then we accept it for the gift it was, and we move on, for there is much work left for us to do, Aegon said, rising to his feet and offering his hand. They walked to where the queen was standing talking to the dragons. Jaime, noticing how both Brienne and Jorah looked nervously at both him and Aegon, with a nod of his head and one from the king, that nervousness soon changed its focus, and it was how they looked at the queen, now that he concentrated on Jaime, watching along with Brienne and Jorah as Aegon walked over to speak to the queen, and the two of them and the red dragon moved their way a few moments later. It's time we leave. There are still many miles to travel, Exon said, and he nodded, walking with the king and Tormund to climb up onto the green dragon. And soon enough they were leaving Summerhall and its ghosts behind. The North 3005 AC. Malaklo. Losing the Ironborn had been an annoyance, one that the silly girl played off as if it was nothing, even though Malika could see her own bitterness in her expression at the fact he'd left her alone. She'd played it off as nothing, as if she'd not cared for the man and that he was just a simple traveling companion. Yet it was clear she didn't believe the words she said, and even were they true, the stupid girl couldn't see why this would be a problem for him. Talisa had no mind for military matters. She'd not cared to spend any time around him when he spoke of such, and had never truly known war until she'd come to these god-forsaken lands. Yet even she'd have grasped the problem, a man who'd traveled with their army, and who ridden off, no doubt right to Winterfell, or the nearest keep he could to speak what he knew about them. Even Talisa would have understood why he was so wroth. This silly girl had known war, had seen war, and according to her, she'd even won a battle due to her own tactical brilliance, something he very much doubted. Sansa Stark claimed to be a smart and clever woman, and yet, each time he'd given her leave to show him something, he'd been left unimpressed. "You're not eating, Malakal?" the insipid girl asked, and he shook his head as he looked at the spread in front of him. "I find I've no appetite, Lady Sansa. It's always the way when I get closer to battle," he said, and she looked at him and nodded before she frowned. "There won't be need of a battle, Malakro. When the garrison at Winterfell sees the force you've assembled and hears my words, they'll open their gates and allow us entry," Sansa said as she lifted up her glass of wine. "And the rest of the North, Lady Sansa?" he asked, humoring her. "They'll understand. They cannot stand against you, and once we explain the truth about Jon Snow, they'll see they've been duped and do what it is they've truly wished to do," she said determinedly. "Crown their queen," he said, raising his own glass, though he barely took a sip and found the beaming smile she gave him to be one he very much disliked. "Indeed," she said, smiling still as she emptied her glass and had another poured. "The Freys and the Lannisters, Lady Sansa, tell me more of them," he asked. He listened as she told him of the events at the Twins, tales he'd heard already, though he felt she held something back. What he was certain of was that it was a faceless man who'd saw to the end of House Frey, though they'd stopped where he would not. They'd left some alive still. Women and children mainly, but Freys all the same, and once he was done seeing to the end of the wolves, it would be the weasels he'd see to next. None would survive his wrath. None any that he'd find that shared blood with Walder Frey would pay. He'd put them all into the ground. "Does House Frey have many matches, my lady?" he asked, curiously. "Indeed, they do, despite their appearance." Sansa set her face, a picture of disgust. Lord Walder was most astute in making matches. There were just so many of them, you see, she said with a chuckle. Malakal would root them all out, find them wherever they were, and see them dead. The wolves, the weasels, and the lions too. "Lord Tywin, you knew him, Lady Sansa?" he asked, and saw her nod his head. "I only met him briefly, Malakal. It was the Queen, Joffrey, and Tyrion that I spent most of my time with," Sansa said, and he nodded. "And this Tyrion and Jaime, they are the last of his children?" he asked, and she nodded again. Yasim Lannister served the dragons once more, and he'd deal with him in time. As for his brother, Sansa said he'd lost favor, and that he'd spoken of making a move to join his sister's side. Something that he'd not be doing now, of course, but still, where would the man go once he had nowhere in Westeros that was safe? Would it be to Essos he'd look? If he did, then Malako would seek him out there once his work was done. Here. He'd kill every single lion he could find too, no matter how long it took him to do so. And when he fell and met his gods once more, he'd do it with a smile upon his face, and his daughter avenged. Jon Snow, Lady Sansa, how capable a man is he? Militarily? He asked. This was both what he wished to know the most and what he hated asking her about just as much. Malakwa, knowing he'd have to listen to a diatribe of how he stole her inheritance, and how it was her and not him that had won the so-called Battle of the Bastards. He would, though, forbear, as he needed to know as much about what sort of man this Jon Snow was, and how he could be used or manipulated. And so he'd choose his questions well. The girl had such a high sense of opinion about herself that he concentrated on her tales out marching through the north and of rallying them to their cause before they faced off against Ramsay Snow. It was there he could truly discern the lies from the truth, and at least those stories were grounded in some sense of reality. While he of course knew of the dragons and had scorpions to deal with them, the tales of an army of dead men and of Jon Snow jumping from one dragon to another while wielding a sword of light were ones that only a fool would believe. Instead, it was as he listened to Sansa Stark say that Jon Snow risked it all and threw away his carefully constructed plan. While she would at the same time tell of how her own plan worked and the Knights of the Vale, who'd ridden for her, she was at pains to say over and over again that gave him his idea. I look very much forward to facing Jon Snow across a battlefield, Lady Sansa. Very much look forward to seeing him fall, he said, seeing her smile at him as she drank even more of his wine. They marched early the next morning and were soon only a few days from Winterfell. He sent his scouts on ahead and was awaiting their return as he formulated his plans in his head. Beside him, she wished to ride, and so he let her, even if she constantly moaned about the weather as she did so. This girl was supposed to be of these lands, and yet she found them even more to her distaste than he or his men did, and he once more found himself almost trying to ignore the words she spoke while giving her platitudes at the same time. She would bring him Winterfell, and in time she'd bring him Jon Snow. And once she'd served her purpose, he'd see she suffered greatly before she left this world. The gods were cruel indeed in taking his daughter away and letting someone like this survive. Tulisa was a bright spot in the world, a force that did good, even if Malaquitqua didn't agree with her. Sansa Stark was anything but. It made him think that he'd been wrong in trying to change his daughter, that knowing at one point he'd have wished her to be like the girl who rode by his side, he'd had been wrong. The last thing he'd have ever truly wished for was his daughter to be anything like Sansa Stark. King's Landing 305 AC. Varys. He read the first of the notes his little birds had brought to him and was pleased to see the realm doing so well. The king and queen had the support of almost everyone within it, and while there would be one or two who'd perhaps always question having a Targaryen back in charge, few would question these Targaryens. He was glad to see. When he heard the scratching at the wall, he looked at it eagerly, watching as yet another of his little birds made his way to him. The whisper he carried far more urgent than these others, giving how quickly he moved. Varys took it from the boy eagerly and handed him the candied fruit and the few coppers, smiling at the little boy as he left back through the hidden door that he had come through. He opened the note, and what he read both pleased and worried him equally. Sunspear had been retaken. Dorne was once again back in the hands of Princess Ariane, and it had managed to be done with the cost of few lives. Was that all the note said? Then Varys would have been a very happy man. Unfortunately, there was more, and what that more was concerned him greatly. The king had broken parley. He'd sent men to sneak into the city and take it, while Quentyn Martell had come to listen to terms. While the negotiations were going on, he'd used archers and others to attack the prince and his party, killing most and wounding and capturing the prince in the process. Varys read on and saw that Quentyn had no wish to parley, and had actually brought hostages who he'd intended to use against the king and queen. Ladies that were related to some of the Dornish lords and knights. "What am I to do?" he said softly, as he finished reading the note. He had no issue with what the king had done. He knew that Aegon would have had his reasons, and that he'd have had the queen's agreement on this also. Dorne had broken parley with House Targaryen before, had even killed a king, and so on, that there was something he could work with, though many may not remember what they did to the young dragon. That Quentyn had brought prisoners and had intended to make an example of one of them if he'd been denied was also something he could work with. No, it wasn't that he had any doubts about the action itself, especially reading of the large army that now headed north. More it was how the realm would react to this news that gave him pause. He sat at his desk for a few moments before rising and making his way through the halls and up the stairs. Soon enough, he found himself outside the Master of Law's rooms, Varys nodding to the two guards and then waiting for Jon Connington to bid him enter. Inside, he found the Grin sitting at his desk. Papers were strewn over it as the man looked to be hard at work. "Lord Jon," he said, taking a seat. "Lord Varys," Jon said. "No offense, my lord, but I'd not expected a visit from you." "Word from Dorne, Lord Jon," Varys said, and he saw how quickly the man's expression changed. "The king, the queen, they are well?" Jon asked worriedly. "They are, safe and well, and Dorne is back in the fold once more," he said to a smile from the older man. He proceeded to tell the Master of Laws the full story of how parley was broken, Quentyn's intent, and that, while they'd taken Dorne with few lives lost, it was only because of both the king's quick thinking and the absence of the army they'd gone to face. Jon looked at him and shook his head when he told them that the army had gone north, which would mean the king, queen, and their dragons would soon be doing likewise. "I'm pleased they are unharmed and the battle ended so quickly, Lord Varys, but the breaking of parley," Jon said concernedly. "That it was in Dorne gives us some room. Lord Jon, the young dragon," he said, and Jon nodded. "But I think we need to focus on the fact that Prince Quentyn brought Lady Yornwood, Lady Dane, and Sarah Daemon's mother to the parley with the intent of both using the threat to harm them to keep his position and to force the king in Queen's hand. That and the willingness to see at least one of them dead to make his point." Varys said, "You mean to lie?" Jon asked him. "I mean to sell a different version of the truth, Lord Jon. You and I both see nothing wrong with the king's actions. That it was Dorne, what Quentyn planned, what has happened in Westeros over the course of the War of the Five Kings and since. Not to mention our king's own family history and his own life and death." Varys said, and he saw how Jon Connington shuddered when he said death. "It's not me. You need to sell this too, Lord Varys. Even were I to find fault in what the king did, I'd find it for the right reasons, given all both sides of his family, and he and the queen have gone through. It's the realm we have them now, more so than we've had them in a long time. The North, the West, the Reach, and Iron Islands, Crownlands, Vale, Dorne, and even the Stormlands. We have them. All I care about is keeping them. So do what you must, and paint the tale in any light you like, as long as the dragons look good at the end of it." "I will. You too should do so, Jon. It's time to declare Quentyn Martell and the army he brought to Dorne as what they were. As foreign invaders, my birds will see it done. Your own men should speak of it, often too," Varys said as he got up from the seat and moved to the door. He made his way to the Tower of the Hand once he'd left Connington's room, finding himself stopped along the way by yet another of his little birds, this one bringing him yet another message from Dorne. Varys smiled when he read it, the words showing the king and queen playing the game, and Dorne cowed before it had a chance to even consider being less than completely loyal to the dragons. As he walked up the stairs, he saw the White Wolf and knew the girl wouldn't be far behind. Missandei appearing almost as soon as he had the thought, and looking a little flustered as she chased after Ghost. "My lady?" he asked amusedly. "Ghost wishes to play, Lord Varys, and I find it takes my mind off where it may go," Missandei said. "In relation to that, I have good news, my lady," Varys said as he told her that the king and queen had taken Sansa's spear, and both they and Grey Worm were unharmed. "This is very good news, Lord Varys," Missandei said with a beaming smile. "They are on their way back?" she asked, and he shook his head. "I'm afraid not, my lady. The army they went to face has headed north, and the king, queen, the dragon guard, and their dragons have gone to deal with them. Grey Worm, Hecknell, and the fleet have set off and now head our way, though," he said. "Then I look forward to their return. I'll inform Lady Arya." Missandei said her happiness at hearing the battle in Dorne was over and everyone was safe, tinged with some sadness over the fact she'd not see the king, and especially the queen, for some time, though he did detect a little bit more joy in her about Grey Worm's own return. "They'll return very soon, my lady. Once they've dealt with the issue in the north, both our king and queen will return." "I've no fear on that," he said, and she nodded at him as she smiled before he then saw her run down the stairs, her guards following her as she chased after the White Wolf once more. Varys continued up the stairs and soon made his way to the Hand Solar, the guards allowing him in as soon as he got there. Inside he found Davos hard at work, as always. The king shits in the hand wipes. That was how it had been under Robert, under Aerys too, he supposed. Now that he thought on it, it was to be different under Aegon and Daenerys. They were different, a king and queen who both ruled, who took an interest in the realm, and while they deferred, they didn't ignore. Davos was their hand, not just because he was someone both of them trusted implicitly, but because in him they had a man who sought to do the same things they did, make people's lives better. Tywin had cared only for his own position, and those who followed were best not thought about. Owen Merryweather was ill-equipped, and John Connington had been too young, too inexperienced, and too eager to please Rhaegar. Corson Chelstead had been a good man and true, and had paid the cost for it. And the less said about Rossart, the better. Both Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark suffered from loving their king far too much, and while it was clear that Davos loved Aegon and Daenerys too, it was a fatherly love, and it was not unconditional. "Lord Varys," Davos said, and Varys realized he'd been standing there quietly for some time. "Forgive me, Lord Hand, I find at times in this room more than most my mind wanders," he said, and Davos gave him a soft smile and nodded. The man able to put most at ease when he did so as to whether or not he truly understood you, or just made you feel he did, the effect was the same. "I can imagine. I think of the many hands who served her, and find myself a poor enough replacement for any of them." Davos said, and Varys almost smiled at just how close to his own thoughts. Davos as had been. "You do yourself a disservice, Lord Hand. I believe the realm hasn't seen as lucky since the Unlikely's time," Varys said, meaning every single word. "I bring news from Dorne." By the time he left the Hand Solar, he'd seen Davos go through many different emotions. The relief that they were both safe, worry that they were flying off to yet another battle, frustration at what the king did and what it would mean, and pride that they'd taken yet another city without needing to use dragons and risking a large loss of life. He'd been able to reassure him on his frustration and what it would mean, and just as with both him and Jon, Davos saw no wrong in what the king had done, and instead it was the worry that others made that caused him concern. He made his way back to his own rooms and began to write out the notes. The word would be spread quickly through his little birds. That tale spun of a king and queen faced with a foreign army and a prince who threatened the life of ladies of the realm, acted swiftly and decisively, and removed that threat. How Dorne had cheered and welcomed them, and how Princess Arianne was now back in her rightful place, and her usurping brother and his. The matter of breaking parley would soon be a distant memory, and though some would speak of it, the truth of things was that the story was written by the winners and not the losers. Rhaegar Targaryen had been a kidnapper and a rapist because Robert Baratheon named him so. Now Robert was a usurper who couldn't accept that a woman didn't wish to marry him. The story was written by the winners, and he would help to frame that story. Varys would do everything he could do to ensure that whatever they faced, it would be the dragons that won time and time again. The North 305 AC. Dany. He'd given her time alone with the dragons, and Dany was most grateful for it. She knew he'd seen something too, and it was clear that so had Jaime Lannister, and so he'd left her to speak to Drogon and Rhaegal and to walk with Leorhawks. She'd seen her mother, dreamed of her in a dream even more real than the ones she'd had so many years before. Dany had felt her mother's arms around her as if she was holding her for true, and had listened to her mother's voice for the first time ever. When she closed her eyes, she could still see her standing there on the cliffs of Dragonstone. "Who are you?" she asked the woman in the distance, her silver hair blowing in the wind as she stood with her back to her. "Who do you think I am, Dany?" the woman said, before she turned. Daneshire looked at her hair so much like her own, her eyes the same color. She was slightly taller than her, but not by much, and there was a familiarity about her that took her a moment to recognize. When she did, she found herself in a battle between her heart and her mind. It couldn't be, could it? Could she truly be who she wished she was? Were the gods that good? "Mother?" she asked, her voice soft and doubtful. "My sweet little dragon," the woman, her mother said, and before she could stop herself, she was running to her, her arms going around her and squeezing her tight as she felt her do the same to her. "Mother," she said, and felt her hand on her cheek as her face was turned up to look at her. Her eyes, their eyes, meeting, and she knew it for true then. Her mother's words not needing to be said. My sweet Dany, long have I wished for this moment, her mother said, her voice full of emotion and tears falling down her cheeks. Don't cry, mother, she said softly, as she moved her hand to wipe them away, not even feeling her own as they fell too. These are happy tears, my love, truly happy, and the first ones I've known since you were born, her mother said. I'm sorry, mother. I'm sorry I killed you, she said softly. Oh, my sweet, sweet child, you did not. It was not you, never you. It was just my time, and I went to my gods happy. Her mother said, confusing her, which she was glad she took notice of. Oh, don't get me wrong, I'd have wished for nothing more than to be with you, to be with your brother, but that wasn't to be my fate. My joy, my happiness was in knowing you lived, Dany, that I had brought you into this world, my sweet little dragon. Her mother said as she kissed her cheek. They stayed like that for some time. Words spoken that she barely heard, and their arms wrapped around each other. Eventually, her mother moved away from her, and Dany went to grab her so as she'd not leave, only to feel her hand being taken, and then they were walking along the cliffs. She smiled as her mother pointed out to the sea and then felt a lump in her throat when she saw him flying in the sky. Her sweet, gentle son was making noises she'd not heard him make since he was Learharx's size, and seeing him as he was meant to be, Dany felt her heart expand when Viserion flew over her head. He came to me when he fell, he came to me and he kept me company as I did him, her mother said. What is this place? Can I come here? Can I find you? She asked, and her mother shook her head. Your time is far from over, Daenerys Stormborn. Your life's still to be lived. One day we'll see each other again. We'll walk these cliffs, fly these skies, but not for some time. There are those you wish to spend your time with, even more than I. Are there not? Her mother said. Rakan Rakala, she said, touching her stomach, when she said the name that she and Aegon would give their daughter. You honor me so, as you have each day you've been in this world, my little dragon. It brings me joy to see you find what I could not, to see you happy. Her mother said, smiling at her. I wish we could have been together, mother. I wish you were in my life, she said sadly. I've always been in your life, Dany, her mother said. I am here with you always, she said, touching her chest, and Dany felt her heart beat against her mother's hand. It's time for me to go, my love. Mother, please, she said as she felt her hand move from her own. I love you always, my beautiful daughter, her mother said, and Dany looked around to find she was alone on the cliff, her sadness threatening to overwhelm her, until she saw her again. Her mother was on Viserion's back, the two of them heading out to sea, and she could not only hear her son's happiness, but feel both it and her mother's too. They'd found each other. In death, they'd found each other. And when her own time came, she'd find her too. But her mother was right. She had a life to live and those she wished to spend it with. She felt Aegon's arms go around her when she opened her eyes. He'd been standing behind her the entire time, and had allowed her the moment to herself that she'd wished for. Just as he had with the dragons, he'd allowed her to deal with this the way she had wanted, and then had been there for her just when she needed him most. Leaning back against him, she felt his lips on her cheek, and then heard his words in her ear. Look at them. Look at how happy they are. Our children, Dany. Look at them, he said. And she looked to the sky. Drogon and Rhaegal were playing with their sister. Laerchiarix was flying from one to another, as they just simply had fun. Children, she said with a small laugh as she watched them play and touched her stomach, thinking of their daughter doing the same when she was growing up, her life to be much different than hers or Aegon's had been. Are we ready to fly? She asked, and felt him hold her more tightly. Soon, he said, and she nodded, looking to the dragons and watching as the skies darkened. They'd stopped at Cape Kraken, Aegon not sure where the army was and not willing to fly over them in the daylight. It had given him time to explain his plan to her. The two dragons would both be used while Learharx would wait safely in the Godswood in Winterfell. Dany could feel the red dragon's annoyance, but unlike her older brothers, arrows could hurt her, and a scorpion bolt, should they have one, would kill her, and so she'd reluctantly agreed to do what they both told her to do. So they waited for night to fall, and to then fly to Winterfell. Aegon worrying that they'd be too late, and yet not willing to risk her or the red dragon by flying into a battle that was already taking place. It gave her time to think also of her mother, of the things she said and how she'd made her feel. She'd not spoken much of it to Aegon, only to tell him she'd seen her and to hear how he'd seen his father, mother, brother, sister, and Elia too. When you died, Aegon, what did you see? She asked, feeling him stiffen. Nothing, I saw nothing, Dany, only the dark, he said, and she turned to look at him. My mother, she said Viserion went to her after he died. She told me that when my time came, I would see her again. She said, slightly worried, that if Aegon had truly seen nothing, that she too would see only that. Perhaps it's different for dragons, he said, and she looked at him confusedly. When I died, I thought I was a wolf. It was all I knew myself as. Perhaps for dragons, it's different, he said. Do you believe so? She asked curiously. I hope so, Dainty. I hope so, he said determinedly. And she kissed him softly. It's time, he said once they were done, and they made their way back to the others. Tormund, Ser Brienne, and Jorah sitting by the fire while Ser Jaime had stood watch. The knight refusing to let them go anywhere without a guard. About fucking time. Were you two fucking again? Tormund said with a smirk as Brienne looked at him annoyedly. We'd not have been back so soon if we were, she said to a loud laugh from the man, and a smirk from Aegon. It's time. We'll reach Winterfell in a few hours. Aegon said, and Tormund rose to his feet, Brienne and Jorah having done so as soon as they'd arrived. The dragons landed, eager to take them to Winterfell and to ready for the fight to come, though Lycaris was pouting almost. As they flew over a large open expanse, she felt Aegon slow on Lycaris, and she looked over to him, though was unable to see him in the dark moonless night. Soon enough, they were flying quickly once more, and she felt rather than saw Winterfell. The dragons landed, and they climbed down off them. Then Drogon and Lycaris took to the sky and flew a little further north to eat and rest, while Lycaris stayed with them as they made their way to the gate. There doesn't seem to be much of an army, Jorah said worriedly. It would have brought them inside, Aegon said, and she saw Jaime and Tormund nod. Or they've not arrived yet, your grace. Brienne said her own worry clear. It matters not, it'll not be men that wins this battle, it'll be the dragons these men face. Ian said, and she smiled at that. These men were part of the same force that had taken Mirren from her, now they came to take the north. What they'd face was just a portent of what was to come. The gates opened, and she smiled to see Ed walk their way. The she-bear and some of the mountain clansmen by their side, and she was happy to see Big Bucket Wall and him, her by the looks of things. I fucking knew you'd come, Ed said as he embraced Aegon and then moved back quickly. Your grace, he said before Aegon this time embraced him. We've not much time, Ed, Aegon said, and then he turned to her, and she moved forward to speak to Lady Maegaz, Lady Lyanna, and to Big Bucket Wall. The Battle of Winterfell, 305 AC. Maege Mormont. The dragons were hidden, and the king now wore a very different look. Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name. It was strange bedfellows she was keeping these days, though there was nothing new in that. She thought, with a smirk. When they'd received the letter on Bear Island, she'd laughed at its contents. She'd always known there was no way that the she-wolf had been kidnapped and forced against her will, and Jon Snow wasn't her king simply because she'd thought him Ned Stark's son, or because Robb Stark's will had named him so. He'd led them through a battle they should have lost. He'd seen her little as she-bear lived still. Aye, the reasons they'd named him king may not have been the right ones, but naming him so was. She'd worried that Lyanna may think differently, but then her daughter had told her the words she'd said when she'd named him the king in the north. She'd thought him a bastard, but there was Stark blood in his veins, and so she'd named him. Was there not still Stark blood in his veins? Now, she had said, and Maege had never been prouder. Had she known he was Lameson then, she'd have named him for that alone, even though it meant he was Rhaegar's too. Had it been a different world and Robert a different man then, he'd have been their son, and they'd have gladly named him their king, as would the realm, because of that. Robert was not a different man, and he was no Rhaegar Targaryen, and so she welcomed the truth and told him so much to his relief. You are my king, from this day to my last. You and her grace are, who I've knelt to, Jon Snow, Jon Stark, Aegon Targaryen. I care not. Your son, and you've proved yourself a true son of the North. Once more. You're here, are you not? When we need you most, you came once again. She'd said the words, and now they rode out to meet the man and his army, an army that dwarfed their own and would take the keep were it not for the dragons they were ready to unleash. Winterfell had a little over 1,000 men, and at least half of those were graybeards or green boys. Waymond's men hadn't arrived yet, but were on their way, and numbered a little over 1,000 more. She'd gathered almost 3,000, her men, the mountain clans, and Galbart's own. As Warden of the North, her job was to protect the North, and so she'd sent the ravens, gathered the men, and then marched hard. Facing them was between 5 and 10,000, or perhaps closer to 20. A true army, a standing army, very few of whom had not bloodied themselves in one way or another. They had more horses, were better equipped, and though they may not know the weather or lands as well as her men, there were more than enough for that not to be a problem. She, Ed, Tormund, Lyanna, Galbart, and Hugo Wool all rode out looking like what they were, while Aegon rode with them, dressed as a simple guard. The party that rode towards them soon had them stunned, not for the usse that led it or for the fierce-looking nature of the men, but because of the redhead that rode with them. The Sen Greyjoy had told them that Sansa Stark rode with this army that marched to their doors, but he was a fucking ironborn squid, and so why would she ever believe his words? As she looked at the smug look on Sansa Stark's face, and finding it reminded her far too much of her mother's own expressions when she'd met the woman, made she thought she should have. Saintia. Malakay's scouts had come back and said the North had rallied a little over 4,000 men. It had surprised her a little, as she'd thought they had much less since both the Battle of the Bastards and the Bail for the Dawn. But it wasn't anything to worry about. That Wintertown was empty was a little more concerning, as it meant they'd taken them into the keep, Sansa finding herself worried about the stores and what shape they'd be in when she took her seat back. It took no time at all for the army to form up, and when the rider arrived, requesting parley, she felt herself smile. It was time for her to shine, to show Malako what words could do, and to take back her home. She took out the small-looking glass and made sure she looked how she should, a returning queen coming back to take back her crown. Then they rode out when the Northmen came towards them. Sansa looking at them eagerly to see who was there. She saw Lady Maegig Mormont and Lord Galbart Glover and told Malako who they were. The large big bucket wool had come, and she frowned at him and at Lyanna Mormont, both of whom were no friends of hers. It surprised her seeing Tormund with them, as she'd thought he'd gone back to the lands beyond the wall, and then she remembered that he and Lady Meigs had seemed close. Ed being there could prove difficult. The man would know better than most there was no truth in her words, but it would be him against her, and who'd believe a common man over the word of a lady such as she? There was no one else of any note other than a few guards, and she smiled at that. Lord Warman, another, who was no friend of hers. House Manderly is not here, Malako. They've not seen fit to offer their men to protect the North, she said happily. Or they lie in wait, Lady Sansa. No matter, my scouts will find them out. Malakoi said. When they reached the middle of the field, Malakor looked at her, and she began to speak, noticing how one of the guards looked her way and feeling annoyed at the audacity of him to do so. My lords, my ladies, I've returned to take back what is mine by right, she said firmly. By what right? Ed said, and she was surprised it was him who did so. By right of blood and law. Jon Snow is not my father's son, and so Rob's will no longer stands since he named him as his brother, which he is not. Furthermore, it's become clear to me that Jon was just as my mother had always feared him to be. A bastard who tried to take that which was not his. The man with me is Malakro. Mahdi, father to my brother's wife, Lady Talisa. He comes to bring vengeance to those who took her life and the life of her husband, and to Jon Snow for his part in their deaths, she said to loud shouts. What's this you say? Tormund said angrily, looking not to her but to a guard. You dare to say such things about our king, Lyanna Mormont said. Lies, Ed said. My lords, my ladies, during my time away from the North, during an exile I was forced into by Jon Snow, myself and Lord Tyrion began to look into things and found certain things which did not add up. It was Jon Snow who set in motion the Red Wedding. Jon Snow who sought to take Winterfell and the North, and he cared not who he harmed to do so. She said to loud shouts once more, You would dare? Have you no shame? Your father would be ashamed to name you his daughter. She ignored the insults, and then it was Ed who spoke up. The look he gave her one of disgust, and she resolved he'd pay for that when she took Winterfell back. You came to Castle Black and sought refuge, and it was Jon who gave you it. He who took you in and offered you protection, and this is how you repay that act. I am ashamed that I opened the gates that day. Shamed I let you in, and could I go back, I'd send you on your way, Lady Stark, Ed said almost spitting, and Sansa noticed the guard looking her way once more. I thought him a brother who'd seek my safety and guarantee my birthright. I came seeking his help and found myself used and lied to by him. Then I was thrown aside when I served no more use, she said, her voice sounding as sad and broken as she could make it. I wish I'd not come to the gates now, too, for the man I found was not, and had never been my brother, or even a Stark, and had I known the extent of his betrayal, I'd have driven a knife deep into his black heart. How could he betray your brother? He was beyond the wall with my people, and we have no fucking maesters or ravens. Tormund said, and she almost smiled as he'd given her the opening she dared to hope for. Who was the Maester at Castle Black? Ed? Who was Maester Aemon? She asked, to no answer from the man. My lords, my ladies, Maester Aemon was Aegon Targaryen. She felt her heart race when she saw them looking at each other, as the realization dawned, and once it did, she prepared the final part of the tale. Jon learned the truth of who he was, not long after he swore his vows. I believe the Maester knew of him, and together they sought to bring down my house. They sought to see my family pay for their part in bringing about their own house's fall, and in doing so, they cost me, my father, my mother, my brothers, and I fear for my sister too. She said, worriedly, though she felt no worry. They planned and plotted, and it was Aegon Targaryen, acting on his bastard nephew's orders that saw the Red Wedding carried out. Their plans almost succeeded too, but events conspired against them, and so we end up where we are today, she said. She was proud of herself. Her moment of triumph was almost complete. A fine story, Lady Sansa. Truly, you missed your calling, and should have been a bard. You truly think so little of us that we'd believe it, though. Was your education that remiss, or was it simply that, unlike the true woman of the North, yours was at the hands of southern septa, while mine own was left to far wiser men? Lyanna Mormont said. How dare you, she said loudly, and she wished to wipe the smirk of the she-bear's face, though she knew she could not. I dare because I can. I dare because I'm a true daughter of the North. I dare because I wield a mace like my mother before me, and I dare because I named a good man my king, and I'll not listen to the nonsense spewed by a silly girl who looked to the south and cared not for the North. I know no king but the king from the North, Aegon Targaryen. Lyanna Mormont said, That's why I dare Lady Sansa. No, would you and this foreign army you've brought to our lands kindly fuck off? You'll not kneel? Malakoi asked as Sansa looked from the she-bear to a guard who was laughing, a guard who was looking somewhat familiar, though she couldn't place him. We do not kneel, Tormund said with a smile. Then we shall bring you to your knees, Malakoi said as he nodded to her, and the horses turned to ride away. Sansa found herself looking at the guard as she turned her horse, seeing how Ed and Tormund looked to him too, how Hugo Woe looked to him, and how the guard nodded to Lyanna Mormont, and the girl almost swelled up in pride, more so from that nod than she did from her mother's pat on her back. It confused her, and she looked even more closely, despite the fact they were now further apart. She looked and she saw, and once she did, the words were out of her mouth before she knew it. Jon? Jon? Jaji shouted out the last one, and she saw how he turned to look at her, and she knew then he was here, that he had been here all the time, and had heard all she'd just said about him. Malakoi. The parley had been a waste of time, just as he'd known it would be. Her words had fallen on deaf ears, and while she would no doubt blame the lords and ladies, the only one truly to blame was herself. She'd added new details to the ridiculous story she'd told him, and in doing so, she'd further shown it to be a complete fabrication and lie. It hadn't been brought up to him that Jon Snow had been beyond the wall when Talisa had lost her life, nor had it been about Aegon Targaryen being the Maester at Castle Black, and he felt it was only done now because of the presence of the Wilding and the former Black Brother. He'd almost laughed loudly when the young she-bear had spoken and put Sansa Stark in her place. Gods, if the girl beside him had half the wit and fierceness of the much younger girl, then he'd perhaps not wish to see her dead. The time for which was coming soon enough. In a way, he was happier that a battle would take place. The walls of Winterfell would be hard to take. But take them they would, and he'd put every single man, woman, and child to the sword, even the she-bear who'd spoken so well. They were riding back when he heard it, Sansa Stark shouting the name out, and Malakoi turning to see the man stopping on his horse and looking her way. He stopped his own and moved it to Sansa's, seeing the fearful look on her face, and hearing her say the name over and over again. Jon? Jon. My lady, what's wrong? He asked, though he was sure he knew what it was, and as he spoke, his eyes looked past her to the man and to the skies, relieved when he saw no dragons, and yet he had to know for sure. It's Jon, she said over and over, her words coming through little strangled gasps. Jon Snow? He asked, and she nodded as Malakoi looked to the man who was stopped a fair distance away from them both. Aye, she said. Malakoi smiled as he turned to his man and motioned to what he carried, and then he looked to Jon Snow, who was staring his way, before he shoved her as hard as he could, and then watched as he hit the ground hard, The look of shock on her face was soon replaced by one of pain, and he wondered if she'd broken the arm that she now held tightly against her as she screamed out. Her eyes were full of confusion as she looked up at him. Soon he'd see the panic in them as he turned to his man and bid him to ready the bow. "I have your sister, Snow. I have your sister. Prepare to watch her die. Or perhaps this time you'll be faster than you were before," he shouted loudly as he watched Jon Snow turn his horse and ready to ride his way. Malako felt it then, the smile on his face as true as it had been in years. One of them would die in the next few moments, both of them, if he got lucky. Saintia, though she'd fall just as she'd said her brother had, and he laughed as he thought of the irony of it. There would be no Knights of the Vale coming to her aid today, no one to save her, and unlike at the Battle of the Bastards, she'd not be sitting on a hill watching safely from her horse. "Run," he said to her as she looked up at him. "Run for your fucking life or my archer will kill you where you lay." Watching her struggle to her feet gave him more joy than he'd known in many a year. Her family, her house, her brother had cost him his most precious daughter, and they'd pay for it with their blood. "Run, run," he shouted in glee as she got up and then stumbled back to the ground before she got up once more. Her arm was broken, he was sure, and as she looked from him to Jon Snow, she began to run. He gave the archer the nod to miss the first shots as he wished her peril to draw Jon Snow closer. And while he watched her run, he rode back to his men, his head turned over his shoulder so he could see her as she fell for what would be the last time. Aegon. He'd sent Dany behind him, Jorah with her on Drogon, and she would come when he gave the signal. Jaime and Brienne stood with their men, ready to march if needed, though they would not be this day. Many years ago, Namesake had faced men and brought the dragons to bear. Dany, too, had done so on the Gold Road. By the end of this day, those would be distant memories, and what he and Dany would do today would be spoken of here and in Essos. For years to come, they wished to send a message, one that would be heard loud and clear not only by those here today, or even by those in Essos, but by those in Westeros, too. The dragons were benevolent and forgiving, but only to those who were loyal. To those who were not there was but one response. Fire and blood, Lyrax rested in the Godswood. Rhaegal was behind Winterfell's walls, and he'd come as soon as he called for him. So he'd ridden out, and he'd listened while the girl he'd named a sister had called him a traitor and a murderer. He'd listened while she'd lied about him, his granduncle, and how he'd felt about Robb. He'd listened and done so quietly. Others had not, and when Lyanna Mormont had said her words, he'd laughed. He couldn't help it. He laughed. She put Sansa in her place so firmly and so truly that he'd felt as proud as no doubt her mother did about her or her father. He thought as he looked to Tormund. Perhaps he shouldn't have. Perhaps it gave him away, but it mattered not. There was to be no peaceful resolution here today, and so he'd thought no more about it. Until she'd called out his name, and he realized he'd messed up, even more so when he saw what Malakwa planned to do as he pushed Sansa from her horse and bid an archer come to him. For a moment he was lost, paralyzed, not that he cared for her or would mourn her death, but because he was no longer here. It was no longer now, and she was no longer her. "Run, brother. Run like the wind." "I'm coming. I'm coming." He felt the tears fall from his eyes and he shouted out, feeling the dragons fly. Drogon had set off. Rogun had set off. Even Learhax had. And Aegon shouted at her to stay, begged for her to stay, and felt relieved when she did so. The horse rode fast, the men with him turning to follow, and he raised his hand and bid them not to. Drogon was too far away. Rogod was too far away. And as he rode, he watched the arrow as it barely missed her. She was stumbling, holding her arm and falling, and then trying to rise as the second arrow just missed her. Aegon looked past her. He looked to the man with the bow, saw him reach for the arrow, and felt that this time it would not miss. Drawing out Longclaw, he felt the light begin to shine. He willed it to shine ever more brightly and for the horse to ride even faster still. Then he was on the ground. Sansa was in his arms, a look on her face he'd not seen before. Gratitude, hope, relief. He knew not only he had her, and he turned her so she was behind him, and Longclaw, and then he watched as the arrow fell harmlessly to the ground. The horse soon bolted, and he looked to see Rackle land and Tormund ride to him, his friend shielding his eyes as Aegon held Longclaw in front of him still. "Take her, bring her back to the keep," he said, as Tormund grabbed her and he heard Sansa's pained yell. Once he saw they were out of range, he climbed up on Rhaegal's back, and they took to the sky. Longclaw shined even more brightly, and as he reached where the archer knelt with his hand covering his eyes, he smiled. "Dracarys," he said, as Rhaegal let loose his flames. "Dany." The waiting had been hard, and when she felt Drogon's agitation, she knew it was time. She climbed up onto his back and bid Jir join her, and then within moments they were in the sky. Dany saw the light in the distance and knew that Axton had unsheathed his sword, which worried her some. They were to use the dragons, and only use men and swords once the battle was won. So she urged Drogon to fly faster, and her son was only too happy to comply. "Sredis, Gurugon, Henmir el Undegon, Yuha Trissi. The scorpions take out any you see, my son," she said, and felt Drogon's anger. Her son would burn them all. "Dracarys," she said a moment later, when she reached the edge of Maliko's forces. The flames were even more fierce than they had been when they'd fought the Night King or Euron Greyjoy's Iron Fleet. Whether this was because of her own feelings for the men they faced, or Aegon's for where they faced them, she knew not, nor did she care. Instead, she just thanked her son, and together she and he brought the fire to the men below them. It was Jorah who pointed out the carriages with the scorpions on them, and Drogon was soon setting them alight. Dany found her own eyes to be looking ahead to the bright light that shined in front of them, and soon she was smiling as she saw Aegon on Rhaegal's back and her other son laying down his own flames as he flew her way. They passed each other, Dany looking to make sure her husband was unharmed and he doing the same to her. Both of them nodding to each other as the dragons cut a fiery swathe through the army below them. How many passes they made she didn't know, but the flames burned high, and beneath them an army burned. Neither Rhaegal nor Drogon were tired, and had they wished it of them, they could have continued for hours to come. But she heard Rhaegal's roar, and then saw Aegon put his sword back in its sheath. He flew to her and pointed back to Winterfell, and since he was laying down no more flames, she and Drogon laid down none either. As they flew back to the keep, she saw the northern army cut down men and accept few surrenders from those who came through the fire. They too wished to send their own message to those who had dared to invade the north. They landed outside the gates, and Aegon practically jumped off Rhaegal's back to come to her, Dany being helped down far more carefully from Drogon's back by Jorah. She saw Sarhaime and Targaryen come their way, and looked to see Tormund nod to Aegon, and then she felt herself being almost lifted from the ground and held in her husband's arms. "You are well, you are unhurt," he asked, and she nodded, smiling as she asked him the same. I am," he said, and she heard the red dragon's chirps as it landed beside them. The pain came then. She felt it in her stomach, and for a moment she thought that something was wrong, that she'd been hurt in some way. She felt it again, and this time Aegon saw the distressed look on her face, and as she looked at him worriedly, she suddenly felt weightless, before she realized she was being carried in his arms, and he was running into the keep. Above her she could see the red dragon flying. The sounds she made were even more excited, and Dany looked to Aegon. She knew why she'd felt the pain. "The master, get the master. The queen is about to have our babe," Aegon shouted, and Dany smiled. Their babe was coming. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. He held her hand as she lay in the bed, the smoke and ash still covering his face and in his hair, and yet he refused to leave her side, even to wash. She needed him here, begged for him to stay, and so he'd sent for water and had the maester clean her first, and was now waiting on more to be brought. That she was worried was plain for any to see. Both of them were, though both worried for different reasons. Dany worried that despite what she'd seen in her dreams, despite lies that it was to happen again, and the gods would show their cruelty to her once more. The thoughts of their babe being born, and of her not seeing her and not holding her in her arms before she lost it, plagued his wife's mind. For Aegon, it was the thoughts of losing her, of losing Dany as he had his mother and as she had her own. He felt he wouldn't be able to go on if he did so, that he'd crumble, and even with their daughter in the world without her mother by his side, he'd turn into the same man his uncle had been. A father in only name who had cared not for the suffering of the child he'd named his own. Despite resolving in his head to never be that way, he feared that the loss of her would break him and their child would suffer because of it. When the water was brought, he looked at her and waited until she nodded before he moved away. He washed no more than a few feet from her and removed his clothes before changing into clean ones. That he was now wearing his most regal of clothing almost made him laugh, and it did at least bring a smile to his wife's face when he rejoined her. "For this you dress up?" she asked with a pained smile. "We're about to welcome a princess into this world, my love. A dragon rider." "I felt it apt," he said, smiling, and she chuckled before she cried out in pain. "Dany," he said softly, grabbing her hand and rubbing his fingers over her brow. "Promise me," she said, and he felt his chest tighten. "Promise me, should I—" "No, you'll be well, our daughter will be well. We'll see her, Dany. We'll see her and her brothers and sisters grow. I promise you that," he said. And she looked at him, nodding as he kissed her lips softly. Lucan once again asked him to leave, and he saw the panicked look on Dany's face and the smile that appeared when he shook his head. Hearing the door open behind him, he turned to see Meg Mormont walk into the room, Aegon looking at her confusedly as she did so, and as the maester told her to leave. "Out of all of us in this room who has birthed before—" "Good. Now get out of my way, you old fool," Maegis said, and Aegon looked to his wife, who nodded, and to the maester, who was nowhere near brave enough to raise another objection. Whatever it was she did or said, he paid no attention to, though he could see that Dany was, and between holding her hand, giving her water when she looked to him, and speaking as assuredly as he could, Aegon was, for lack of a better word, useless. His hand did, however, give his wife something to grip tightly, and he was glad he'd not used his sword hand, as after some time he found even he was feeling pained. Thought compared to what it was his wife was going through, it was not something he could or would ever complain about. "Is she Dany?" he called out, when her eyes closed. His voice panicked as he readied to shake her, only for Maege to threaten him with facing her mace, if he dared to do so. "Don't you fucking dare, Your Grace. She's just passed out. She'll come around in a moment. Let her do so herself, or so help me, I'll smack you upside your stupid fucking head with my mace." He didn't see the shocked look on Walken's face, and he was in no way going to call the woman out for threatening a king. Maege knew more than he did about what was going on, and so he deferred her and breathed a huge, relieved sigh when Dany's eyes opened. A moment later, "Is it over, my babe? Where is she?" Dany asked panically. "It's not quite time, Your Grace." "A few more moments," Maege said, and he saw Dany relax. How he kept his calm when the screaming started, he didn't know. He barely even saw their babe being born. His eyes were focused on Dany all the time. His words were ones that he hoped offered some comfort, though if she'd not even heard them, then he'd understand completely. It was only when maids called to him that he looked to see Rhaella was actually here. "Dany, she's Dany, our babe, Dany," he said over and over again. He felt her gasp when Maege moved away with their babe, felt her try to rise, and he could understand her fear. But Maege went only as far as the water and the clean cloths to clean their daughter. Walken did the same to Dany, as both he and she looked at Maege and the babe she now brought their way. "A healthy girl, Your Grace. A very healthy girl," Meg said, her smile beaming. She handed Dany the babe, and Aegon watched her all the way. His wife's eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them before, the tears unshed, but they're all the same. He said nothing, just allowed her to hold their daughter in her arms and to look down upon her, all her fears, all her doubts, that perhaps she'd not see their daughter into this world, were gone, and the look on her face was one he'd take with him to the grave. "Aegon, look at her. Look how beautiful she is," Dany said, willing him closer. He moved to lay on the bed beside her, his hand reaching out to touch their daughter's small face, and he smiled when he saw the violet eyes taking in the world around her for the first time. The hair on her head was dark, and yet he could see only her mother in her, and that made her only even more perfect in his mind. Aegon kissed her softly on the top of her head before kissing Dany on the cheek, his wife barely noticing him as he did so. Her own eyes were focused on the babe in her arms, and even when he rose from the bed, she barely paid him any mind. Aegon, though, needed to know for certain that they were both well. So he moved to Walken and bid Maege join him, standing facing the bed so he could see both his wife and his daughter. He began speaking softly. "They are both well, we have nothing to fear," he asked, his voice calmer than he truly felt. "Both mother and babe are well, Your Grace. I'd recommend Her Grace stay abed for tonight, and should she wish to move around, then to do so on the morrow, and not to move too far." Walken said as Aegon looked to Maege. "My lady," he asked, "make sure she eats something. Your Grace, and that she tries to feed the babe. It may be hard at first for her, but stay with her and offer her comfort and encouragement. I'll see a wet nurse is found, just in case. But, aye, mother and babe are well, Meg said with a large smile, and Aegon felt all his pent-up worries leave him. I thank you both, Master, Lady Maegis, he said, and he saw the maester swell up a little. May I have a moment, Lady Maegis? He said, and the maester moved to the door. As the master left the room, Aegon was torn between looking at Dany and Rhaella and at Lady Maegis, and given the smile on the woman's face when he turned to her, he reckoned he'd done far more of the former, much to her agreement. Sansa, my lady, he began, only for the woman to shake her head. We'll be well guarded and looked after. Think not of her this night, your grace. You have much better, and more pleasant things to think about. I thank you, my lady, truly, he said, and she nodded before moving to the door, Aegon following with her. Sir Jaime, Sir Brienne, and Sir Jorah all stood there, and he bid them enter the room, the three knights looking past him to Dany and Rhaella as they walked in. He could see the smiles on each of their faces. Jorah's especially, though Jaime's wasn't much lesser. My wife and daughter are well, good sirs, he said as Daenerys looked to see them there. Princess Rhaella Targaryen, our daughter, Dottie said, smiling beamingly at them as she turned their daughter to face them. Aegon, seeing two sets of violet eyes where once there had only been one, and knowing there wasn't a thing he'd not do for either of them. Winterfell 305 AC. Dany, she had felt no regrets when she and Drogon had brought the fire to the men from Essos. If anything, she'd almost enjoyed it. Not the killing, not seeing them die, but making them pay for what she feared they'd done to her people in Meereen. When she'd landed and she had seen Aegon and Rhaegal were unhurt, she'd been relieved, and then the pain had come, from the moment Aegon took her in his arms. Right up until she held Rhaegal in her own had been a worry of alike. She'd never known before. Her dreams, the master, Lady Mage, and even Aegon himself hadn't been enough to make those worries go away. She had loved that he'd stayed with her, had needed him too, and it did bring her comfort. Yet when her eyes closed and she passed out, she had feared the worst. It was only when she held their daughter, when she could touch her and look into eyes that matched her own and could hear the little noises she would make, that she finally relaxed. Holding her, showing her to Aegon, to her dragon guard, and feeding her when she was hungry, all of it was a joy she had never known before. A true happiness of a kind she had never dared to wish for, and yet had always sought. It amazed her. She amazed her. Dany had come to Westeros for a crown to fill the empty space that not having a family had left in her heart. She'd not come looking for a family and had never imagined she would ever know one. Even when she met Aegon and thought him but a northern fool named Jon Snow, she'd not considered that could lead to this. When the truth of him and of his feelings for her were clear to her, she'd thought that was what happiness felt like. She was wrong, this was. It wasn't the two of them together, it was the three, she, her husband, and their daughter, their family. Hearing the excited sounds of her children outside the window made her move from the bed and disturbed Aegon, who was laying beside her. Her husband wasn't asleep and hadn't even had his eyes closed. Instead, just like she had been, he was laying in bed looking at the most precious thing in both their worlds. She shook her head at him to show him there was nothing wrong, but Aegon rose anyway and walked with her to the window. While she held Rhaella, he opened the shutters and she looked out to see all three dragons flying almost close enough to touch. Drogon and Rhaegal turned to her, and Learhex flew even closer. Aegon moving in front of her, and Rhaella just in case the red dragon's excitement was too much. It was then she heard it. From Drogon and Rhaella it was deeper and further away, but as Learhex flew closer to the window, Dany could hear it clearly. They're singing, she said happily. They're singing to their sister, she said as she turned to see the awestruck look on Aegon's face. It's beautiful, Dany, Aegon said, and she nodded as she looked to Rhaella. Can you hear them, my sweetling? Can you hear your brothers and sisters sing for you? She asked, and was rewarded with a smile. The song was indeed beautiful, all three dragons almost complementing each other as if they were a band of minstrels. Only the cold air of the north forced her away from the window, and even as she moved back into the warmth of the room, she could still hear the song, just as clearly. She felt Rhaella move to her breast and knew she was hungry. Once more, and so she took a seat by the fire as Aegon spoke to the dragons before he closed the window. Feeding her daughter was a joy in of itself. Aegon having told her that they'd arrange a wet nurse if she could not, and Dany both determined and delighted to find that she could. It made her feel even closer to her somehow, and it took her some time to realize why it was so important to her. Her own mother had never had this chance with her. Life had been far too cruel to allow them to know this feeling. With Rhaegar, it had been the same, though it was his life that had been stolen from her, which made it so. To hold Rhaegar in her arms, to feed her and care for her as a mother should. She felt the tears fall as her daughter ate hungrily. Dany ate? Aegon asked worriedly. I'm well. I'm happy. Aegon, my tears are because I'm so very happy, she said, and he nodded before he kissed her cheek. She almost didn't notice him go to the door or hear what it was he said to Ser Jaime or Ser Brienne. Even when he came back in and took a seat across from her, she barely paid him any mind. Her entire focus was on the babe in her arms as she hungrily ate at her breast, Dany smiling broadly as Rhaella ate her fill. Once she was done and she'd made sure there was no trapped wind, something Lady Maejed told her she must do after feeding. She saw her daughter's eyes close, and so she carried her to their bed. Sleep, my little dragon. Sleep and dream of wonderful things for your father. And I wish them for you and will make sure that each and every one of your dreams come true, she said, kissing her daughter on the cheek. Dany, come, you need to eat. X said softly, and she almost shook her head at him, only to hear her stomach rumble. The food arrived a few moments later, and she realized that Aegon had sent out for it. Dany smiling as it was laid down on the table in front of her, and then as Tormund walked in a moment later, she moved to tell him to be quiet. Worried that his loud voice would wake Raxalot, only to hear him speak so softly that she was sure it was some sort of a jape. Where is the little dragon? Tormund asked, his voice a whisper. Come, I'll show you her, Aegon said proudly, and though she wished to join them, her hunger won out, and so she ate as they moved to the bed. She could hear them, though, both of them speaking, and the pride in Aegon's voice was only outshone by the joy she could hear in Tormund's. Dany listened as he told Aegon that he'd never seen such a beautiful babe and that he could already see that despite her being so small, she'd be mighty just like her mother. When Aegon told him that just like her mother, Rosier too would fly on a dragon, Tormund laughed, and again she was amazed by just how quietly he did so. Even the slap he gave Aegon on the back was far quieter than it normally would be. And though she didn't hear what exactly he and Aegon spoke about after that, they soon walked from the bed and joined her. She is a fine babe, Dragon Queen. Her mother's child, thank the gods. I'd hate to see anyone afflicted with the little crow's looks, Tormund said, wiggling his eyebrows, and she almost choked on her food as she laughed. Get out of here, you fool, Aegon said, chuckling, as Tormund slapped his back once more and then nodded to her before leaving the room. She offered Aegon some of her food, but he shook his head, pouring himself a mug of ale instead, and then taking a seat across from her. While she had her back to the bed, he did not, and though he was speaking to her, she was pleased to see him pay as much, if not more attention to Rosiella behind her. What else did Tormund say? She asked, as she finished eating and took a large swallow of the cool milk which tasted incredible on her tongue. It's nothing. It's not important, Aegon said. Aegon? She asked, leaving no room for doubt that she wished for him not to keep it to himself. Malako. He lives still. He was burned and he will die, but he lives still, Aegon said, and though she knew he was telling the truth, it was clear that wasn't all Tormund had said. The rest, Aegon, she said determinedly, and she saw him sigh. Sansa, he said, she asked for me, perhaps she wishes to plead her case. Aegon said. She looked at him and could see the anger threatening to overwhelm him as he spoke his cousin's name. If their daughter wasn't asleep, feet away from them, she felt he'd have given in to that anger already, only that he was in no mood to leave either of them alone. She felt he'd have gone to the training yard and taken it out on someone, or perhaps he'd have sought the comfort of the skies as she did from time to time. For now, he just let it simmer and kept it ready to boil below the surface, and she admired his restraint. It had always been something she'd not been able to do, to restrain the anger she felt at times, and she'd heard from his own lips that Aegon too had found moments where he could not. Or to be more precise, Jon Snow found moments like that. Aegon Targaryen channeled that anger, and as she looked at him, she could see he was doing so now. Go do what you must, Yakon, she said, and he looked at her shaking his head. Go, you'll be the better for it, and you're not just a husband and a father, you're a king too. Go be a king and then come back to us as a father and husband, my love. Dany, go Aegon. I'd go with you if I could, But go and see to what needs to be done. We'll be here waiting for you to return," she said, and finally he nodded. He got up from his seat and walked over to her, kissing her deeply before he moved to the bed, and she watched him kiss Rosietta's forehead. Then he was tying on his armor and his sword, and she smiled to see it was Blackfire and not Longclaw that he wore when he left the room. She finished drinking the milk and called for a servant to take the plates away, while she then moved to lay down beside their daughter. "Your father is gone to show them a dragon, my sweetling, to show them a king. Sleep and dream, and when you wake your father and I will both be here for you. We'll always be here for you. My love, always," she said, as she snuggled up beside Rosiel and watched her daughter as she slept. Winterfell 3005 AC. Jira. When he'd heard they'd intended to attack the north, he'd wished to be gone from Dorne as quickly as possible. Their fight wasn't in the sands, it was in the snows, and he was happy to find that his king and queen agreed with him. It was why he took no issue with what Aegon had done. Not only was the Martell boy seeking to break parley himself, but they had bigger things to worry about, and he had family who'd be at risk. So it had meant nothing to him to see parley broken, though he had enjoyed seeing his king and queen cowed the Dornish afterward. Both of them worked well together. They complemented each other. Aegon was ice to the queen's fire, though Aegon had fire to spare too, he thought with a chuckle. They'd left immediately after Dorne was secured, and though he feared each mile they flew, he also knew they'd make it in time. Still, he'd been relieved when they did, and when he'd seen his aunt and cousin were both safe and well, the battle itself, if you could call it that, was over in the blink of an eye. Men were no match for dragons, and his king and queen used Drogon and Rhaegal to devastating effect. Once more Jorah felt their actions were more than justified, and he knew that Aegon wished a message sent, as did his queen. The fear and worry only truly came to him after they'd landed, and when he'd heard the pain scream from his queen, he'd thought at first she'd been struck, that an arrow had somehow landed, only to find it was pain of a different sort that his queen was suffering. That brought a different kind of fear to the surface. Jorah, remembering all too well how she'd been after Rhaego, and feeling that were it to happen again, it could very well break her in two. So he'd paced outside the room, as if it was his child being born, and when he'd finally been called into the room and saw her holding the babe in her arms, he thanked the gods for their mercy. "Princess Rella, our daughter." He smiled at how she'd held her up and how she'd said her name. The look on her face, one that he wished his queen would wear constantly. Rosier looked healthy. Her hair would be as dark as her father's by the looks of things. Her eyes, gods, her eyes were her mother's through and through. When they'd left the room, he was surprised at what the king asked him to do. More so because it was him and not Jaime Lannister that he had spoken to. "I need to know what happened, Jera, the enemy forces, my cousin, how the North feels about what they saw. Speak to your aunt and cousin, to Ed and to Tormund. Take a walk among the northern lords and look over the battlefield. I'd do so myself, but," Aegon said, looking back over his shoulder at the bed. "I understand, your grace. I'll see it done. Sir Jaime and Sir Brienne, though, they stay on guard here. Both of them, your grace," he said, and Aegon nodded. "Thank you, Sir Jorah." So he'd done as had been bid and had sought out his aunt and cousin, finding both in the great hall, where celebrations were already in progress. If Aegon worried that his or the queen's actions had caused any doubt amongst the northern lords, then he was soon to be very much relieved. Far from doubting his king or queen, they were lauding them both for coming directly here and seeing the threat ended before it ever truly began. Jorah walked into the great hall to chants of the Jon and the Daenerys from the mountain clans, to Dragoon Queen and Dragon King from Tormund Giantsbane, and to the dragons from almost everyone else, seeing his aunt speaking to his cousin and the broad smile on Lyanna's face as she was evidently told of the babe's birth, he was stunned. Though even more so when his cousin climbed up onto a chair and bid the room to quiet, and it did so almost immediately. "My lords, my ladies, men and women of the North, I have some wonderful news to share with you. Her Grace has just given birth to a daughter, a princess of House Targaryen, born here in the heart of the North." "The Princess of the North," Lyanna said, holding up a mug of something he was sure was ale. "The Princess of the North. The Princess of the North. The Princess of the North." He found himself with a mug in his hand that he had no idea who'd put there, and he too was cheering just as loudly. Jorah hadn't considered it, but now as he drank and moved to where his aunt and cousin were, as people slapped his back when they saw the colors he wore, He did, though the North had come around to his queen and even to Aegon not being who they thought he was. This would only solidify the loyalty for years to come, a princess of the blood born in the North. A dragon rider who one day would be queen, having been birthed amongst smoke and ash in the fires of battle in Winterfell. Legends were written about far less. "Come, nephew. Drink," his aunt said, and he took a seat beside her, though he sipped rather than swallowed his ale. "They seem happy," he said, and his aunt nodded. "Aye, the battle and the babe. A good title for a song, don't you think?" his aunt said, chuckling, as Tormund came over and began to speak to Lyanna. Jorah, watching as his cousin laughed at something the man he now knew was her father, said, "The king asked me to see how they were taking it." "The battle?" he asked as his aunt smiled at her daughter and Tormund. "I think he'd like what he'd see. He did good here, Jot. There's not a man or woman here who doubts that," his aunt said. "He'll be pleased by that, and by the babe's reception," he said. Lyanna named it true. A princess of the North. She belongs to us all. Jorah, not just the king and queen, she's our princess, too. "Rosiella," he said, as Lyanna looked at him. "After the queen's mother?" his cousin asked. "Aye," he said, seeing the smiles on both his aunt and cousin's faces. He spoke briefly to some of the other lords who made their way to his table. Galbart, the Wall, and some more of the northern lords before he then spotted Ed speaking to a woman a little way off. As he got up from his seat, Tormund asked him how Aegon and the Dragon Queen were doing and about the babe, and he told him all were well, and no doubt they'd wish to see him. Then he made his way to Ed and to the woman who he found out was called Josie and was Ed's future wife. "I need to walk the battlefield, Ed. Join me?" he asked, and he could see that, while the man was reluctant, he wouldn't say no. After giving him time to speak to Josie, the two of them left the great hall and made their way to the courtyard. Ed calling for horses to be made ready, and Jorah spoke to him while they waited. "Lady Sansa?" he asked. She broke her arm and has asked to speak to the king. "I had one of the men set it for now, and I've sent word to the maester to go to her once he was done with the king and queen," Ed said. "He's done." "The babe, she's well, her and the queen?" Ed asked. "Aye, both are well. She's a fierce little thing. A dragon if I ever saw one," he said fondly, and saw the smile on Ed's face. "The lucky sod has it all now," Ed said, smirking still. The horses were brought to them, and they wasted no time, both of them eager to ride and see what they needed, and then to ride back. More so once he actually saw the devastation up close. No man could survive this, he thought, and yet he found out that some had. One in particular that was sure to arouse the king's interest. "Malakor lives?" he asked, and Ed nodded. "If you can call it living." Man's burnt down one side and screamed constantly. Even after what he'd done, no man would have begrudged him some milk of the poppy, so he's resting now, I'd imagine. "The rest?" he asked, and Ed shook his head. "Barring a couple of dozen lucky to be found after the North had its fill of blood, the rest are as you see," Ed said. "How many did the North kill?" "A few hundred, perhaps close to 1,000, though at least half of that was ending, men who'd been burned rather than men who fought. There was supposed to be 15,000 here, close to 20,000. Jorah said, his voice soft as the reality of what had been done finally sank in. "Then they are with their gods, whomever they are, and good riddance to them," Ed said. "You take no fault with the king and queen?" he asked. "Why would I?" "Do you think Malakor intended me to live? Josie? Your aunt or cousin? That man was burned half to death when they carried him through Winterfell's gates, and still he was saying he'd see us all dead. What was done here wasn't cruel or unjust. Far from it. It was righteous," Ed said, and Jorah nodded. They arrived back at Winterfell just as Lord Wyman and his men arrived, the Lord both happy and yet disappointed that he'd missed the battle and the birth of the babe. "Their graces used the dragons?" he asked him and Ed. "They did," Jorah said, "and destroyed the army completely." He added, looking to the man to judge his reaction, "Thank the gods. And the babe." "She's well?" Wyman asked. "Aye, Princess Rosia Targaryen, the princess of the North," he said, and saw Wyman's smile. "The gods have spoken indeed, a healthy babe and a victory. The gods have shown their favor, and I feel in the need for ale," Wyman said, laughing as they walked into the keep. King's Landing, 305 AC. Miss Sindai. As much as she liked being involved in things she was bored too. She missed Grey Worm and the king, but mainly she missed being by her queen's side. Ghost was a fine companion, and she spent some of her time with Arya too. Ser Davos wished for her counsel, which she gave him, and she tried to get a reed, and the others in her king and queen's small council. Jon Connington was as much Aegon's man as Jerigal would always be. Dany's, the man spoke of the king as if he'd known him all his life, and though he had not, she understood why that was. His history with the king and queen's house, with Prince Rakhar, was a complicated one, but it made him leal to Aegon and to Dany by default, and so she had no fears regarding him. Varys she at first hadn't trusted. There was something about the way he would look at Dany that gave her pause. It was Aegon who had explained it to her queen, though, and her queen had then explained it to her. Varys has served bad rulers before. He is wary, and so I did not have his full support, Dany said as Missandei fixed her hair. Then perhaps it's for the best if he is gone, my queen. Perhaps, though it's no crime to ask questions or have concerns, I am not always right, and other than you, who do I have, who questions me, without doubting my decisions? Varys's doubts, though, were in not knowing who I was and what my reign would bring. He doesn't doubt it now. He is with me, and Aegon, Missy, he may question, but only for the right reasons, just as you do, Dany said, and she nodded. She hadn't had a chance to speak much to the master of ships, and since he'd left with the king and queen, she'd have to wait to do so. Lady Kinvara was completely on the king and queen's side, just as the other strange lady who'd traveled to Dorne with them was, which left Lady Anya Waynwood. The woman was someone she'd tried to get to know, and though she'd been friendly enough, it was hard for her to do so. Missandei had thought that perhaps the woman disliked her as some of the Northmen had because she was not from Westeros. Soon, though, she'd found that it was a far simpler reason why they didn't truly spend time together. Lady Anya thought her too young and inexperienced. Over the course of the few meetings of the small council, though this soon changed, and while she'd never claimed the woman to be fully behind the king and queen, few other than those who truly knew them were, she was sure the woman was not a threat. It relaxed her and made going to the meetings more enjoyable, if still as boring as ever. This one, though, was anything but, and she looked at Davos with a million questions in her head at the news he'd just given them. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, she's healthy, as is her mother. And though it'll mean their graces need to stay a little longer in the north, they'll all return soon enough. Davos said, a beaming smile on the man's face as he spoke of the babe and her queen. Rhaenyra, Jon Connington said wistfully. A princess, Varys said, smiling. Missandei was barely able to keep her own smile from her face as she sat and listened to them speak. She heard them talk of the battle and how it was done. The forces that had been sent to the north were defeated completely. Yet her mind was only truly on the fact that her queen had a babe, and that both the babe and her queen were well. Many nights they'd spoken since the queen had found out she was with child, and the one thing abundantly clear was just how much she wished for it. Just as she'd needed Aegon and the love he brought to her, the support and reassurance he'd given her from the moment they'd sailed north, her queen needed a babe. She needed this babe to be born and to be healthy, and Missandei felt her joy and her relief in equal measures. We must inform the realm, let them know that their graces have an heir, that the princess has been born and they are both well. I'll speak to Lady Kinvara, to the Septons and the Septas. Lord Varys, your little birds should spread their whispers, and I'll leave to go and speak to Arya now. Missandei said, rising to her feet. She gave Davos a nod and a smile and was gone from the room without awaiting an answer. Ghost was waiting for her outside, and she knelt down to tell the wolf that he had a new little dragon to protect. Missandei laughing when he licked her face, and then she told him to lead her to Arya. Surprisingly, she was taken to the girls' rooms rather than the sparring yard or elsewhere, and when she entered it was to find her ill in bed. Has anyone been to see her? She asked Gendry, and he told her that he'd brought someone, and that Arya was with child. I'm happy for you both. You are happy, she asked, and he and then Arya both nodded. Missandei looking on as Ghost moved his head to Arya's stomach, and Arya rubbed her hands through his fur. Is something wrong, Jon? Dany? Arya asked worriedly. No, they're both unhurt. They've dealt with the army in the north, but that's not why I've come to speak to you, she said, smiling. You're an aunt, Arya, aunt to a nice Rhaenyra, she said. She was born. She's well, isn't she? They heard Dany. Yodye asked, and Missandei nodded. They'll need to stay a little longer until she's ready to fly. But they're well, all of them. Over the next few days, she spoke to Lady Kinvara, to Septons and Septas. They even had an announcement made on the site of the burned-down Great Septon, one at the gates of the Red Keep. They rang the bells of the city to announce the princess's birth, and she was happy to see people rejoice and cheer for her king, queen, and princess. A week later, when she saw the ships arrive, she felt her excitement rise, and so she hurried to the docks to welcome the men back. She looked to see Kono, Grey Worm, the strange lady, and Daario all making their way down the gangplank, and she both smiled and frowned at the same time. More so when she shared the news, and she saw how Daario looked when he heard, "Queen, king, princess, safe?" Grey Worm asked. "Very safe. They're all well and shall return soon. The Kalis and cow have their Kaleka. We shall give thanks to the great stallion tonight." Kuso said, smiling. Miss Endia wished she could enjoy the happiness of the others, but her eyes were on Daario's all the while. She would need to speak to him, but for now she wished to be alone with Grey Worm, and they had many things to discuss, she thought with a wicked smile. It was the next day that she got her chance to speak to Daario, finding him sparring in the yard against some men he easily beat. She heard him make mention of the queen, though unusually for him, he kept his bragging to a minimum. Waiting until he was done, she stood by and noticed that he had seen her arrival, and he was delaying speaking to her for some reason. Eventually, though, he moved to her. The same cocky grin on his face that he usually wore was there once more. "It stops now, Daario," she said, and he glared at her until he saw the White Wolf rise to his feet. "I know not what you mean, Miss Andevnadievnadiand," Daario said with a chuckle. "It stops now. Our queen is not who she once was, and has and will have no interest in you. Not only is her heart fully Aegon's, but he's given her what no man could, a babe. Try and come between them, and it will end in blood. And believe me, on this, it'll be your that comes out. The worst for it," she said firmly.
"I fail to see what she sees in him,"
he said, and though his usual cockiness was in his reply, she found she didn't believe it fully this time. "No, you don't? He could end you in the blink of an eye. Jurix and Grey Worm aren't just no match for him. They're not even close." "His wolf," she said, rubbing Rosie's. "His dragon either would end you, if they thought you a threat. You should be grateful they do not," she said, moving away from the man. "I could make her happy. I did make her happy," Daario said softly. "I've known my queen longer than you have. Trust me on this. This is the first time I've ever seen her happy. I'll speak no more on it. Our queen liked you, Daario. Despite losing her city, she'd not see you harmed. Try and come between her and the man she loves, the father of her child. Then you had better hope it's Aegon who ends you. For believe me, our queen would make you suffer unimaginably," she said as she finally walked away. She hoped he got the message. It would pain her queen for the man to die. Pain her, but only briefly. Essos 305 AC. Delicho? Court the greatest city there was or ever would be, he laughed at their audacity. If he so wished, he could see this city crumble into the sands that surrounded it. As the ship docked, he bid his guards make ready, and soon enough they came to him. The representatives from the 13 at first, and then the pureborn behind them. They were arrogant, dismissive at first, and then finally they realized who exactly it was they were dealing with. It was neither of these groups that he was here to see, and so put out and annoyed their representatives, left insulted. He cared not and simply made his way to who he had come to speak to. The Tourmaline Brotherhood weren't as powerful as the 13, the Pureborn, or the ancient Guild of Spicers, at least not in terms of courtine importance. For his own, they were the only group in this city that mattered, and when he arrived at the palace owned by Lazafasakniarnine, it was to find the man already waiting for him. There was no pretense with the welcome, no false courtesy or dismissive attitude. Lazafas stood with a large smile on his thin face as he welcomed him into his home. His guards, his men, and he were given rooms and a place to bathe, and they were feasted that night. They were offered their pick of the men, women, and children to do with what they wished, and yet neither he nor they partook in anything other than food and drink, much to Lazafas's delight. "Your men are remarkable, Bellico. Few turn down the delights of the flesh," Lazafos said as they drank. "My men know why they are here, Lazafas. They know what it is I require of them, and how things will be shall they earn my favor or not. They'd not risk my displeasure for a night in a bed with a warm body beside them, not when they know it'll result in a lifetime elsewhere, beside a cold one," Bellico said. "When do you intend to take the city?" Lazafos asked. "You are sure he has it?" he asked, and the man nodded. "Then the city is already mine. After the feast was over and done with, Lysafos asked to see the piece he'd taken from Mirain, the man dropping to his knees once he did so. As High Priest of the Church of Starry Wisdom, Bellico was owed his fealty by right. Being in possession of a piece of the Black Stone, knowing what it truly was, and that he was actively looking to bring all the pieces together, Bellico had the man's unyielding loyalty. When he went to his bed that night, it was to dreams of the carnage that the city would know before the night was done. He'd seen them fall, and so he slept and dreamed, and when he woke up in the morning, it was to flames, death, and destruction. With his guards, he moved through the city, listening to screams and knowing he was the cause for most of them. It took them some time to arrive at the palace that belonged to Stolero Venalis, his guards dead and the man's family soon to follow. Entering in through the gates, he smiled to think he'd taken this city, this palace, with less than 1,000 men. He smiled to think that he'd soon have yet another piece of the Black Stone in his hands. Winterfell 305 AC. Sansa. Her arm throbbed. The pain was terrible, and yet it was the knowledge that she'd been played which hurt the most. The Theand had been right. He'd told her she couldn't trust Malico, and yet she had. Why? Why trust another man when she knew they were all fools? Were they, though? The voice in her head called out. Were they, or are you? It said as she tried to shake it away. She'd been certain that he'd believed her words, that she'd gotten him to think how she wished him to. Sansa had been so very certain that she'd finally found the tool to bring her vengeance and justice against Jon and his dragon whore. Not only had Malachor not been on her side, but he'd also been actively against her. She thought bitterly as she felt another shooting pain in her arm. When he'd pushed her from the horse, she'd not known what to think. No, that wasn't true. She'd not been able to think. It made no sense to her, confused her, and by the time she realized what it was she'd gotten herself into, it was too late. Run. Run! The words stung as she saw what it was that he planned to do. The knowledge that she'd put the idea into his head, only making her annoyance at herself grow. She'd seen the archer, the horse, the distance to safety, and had found herself in her brother's shoes. It was not the brother's shoes that she had wished to be in. Falling, stumbling, and barely able to understand how she'd ended up in the position she was in, she tried to run. Whoosh! Twang! Whoosh! If she closed her eyes, she could still hear the sound of the bowstring, the sound of the arrow as it was let loose and flew through the air. Even knowing they had missed her brought her no great comfort, as she knew that just like Ramsay with Rickon, Malico was playing a game, this time she the prey and not her brother. She remembered words she'd spoken moons ago, of what Ramsay would do, and of how her brother was already gone. Was he? Could he have been saved? Did she wish him to be? Sansa wanted to believe she did, that she hadn't wished him dead. But then she thought of Jon and knew she'd wished it for him, and so she wasn't sure anymore. It was a scab she didn't wish to pick at too much. And yet, pick at it she did. Rickon was a male heir, she a female one, a true-born son of Ned Stark, while Jon was a bastard. Both were threats to her crown. And yet she'd been convinced that one was lesser. They would never pick a bastard over a true-born daughter of Ned Stark. Sansa, my love, Littlefinger said as they rode to the hill. What about a true-born son? She asked worriedly. The Knights of the Vale rode for you, Sansa. You ordered them into battle, not I. So they had, so she did, but she'd waited until the time was right, until she knew that Ramsay was certain to be beaten and couldn't escape. Until Rickon fell. Until you'd thought Jon had too. Finally, the maester came, and as he fixed her arm, he spoke of the babe that had been born, telling her she was an aunt, as if she cared about such a thing. She smiled at him, batted her eyes, and Walken left the room and her to her thoughts as she closed and remembered. She was dead. The next arrow would be the one. She was dead, and then he came, just as he did with Rickon. Even after all she'd done, he came for her. For the briefest moment, she felt such joy, such relief, and then she had felt the worry. What if he didn't make it in time? What if it was but a mummery? A show? There had been light. She was lifted and she had thought the arrow had hit home and it was to the gods she was to go. Only to find that she'd been saved and that it was soon Winterfell's gates she was been taking through. Behind its walls and far from danger. When she woke the next morning, she felt a new resolve as a new realization had dawned on her during the night. He cared, he still cared, despite all she'd done, he cared. And that gave her a way to him, a way to what it was she wished for more than anything in this world. When the meal came, she ate it hungrily, and over the course of the morning, though her arm hurt her, she felt far lighter than she had the day before. It was not to last long. "You come with us, my lady," Ed said, standing at the door with Tormund and some guards. "Are you taking me to my brother?" she asked with a smile. She'd asked to see him and been denied the day before. "To your trial," Tormund said, and the lightness went from her in an instant. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. He didn't wish to be here. He wanted to stay in their room with them both, to just look at them both. His wife was happier than he'd ever seen her before, and he wanted to share in that happiness. Rhaenyra gods, his daughter, never did he think he could feel how he did when he looked upon her. Dany was his heart. He had known that far better this time around. Rhaenyra, though, was already his soul. She'd cleansed it, removed the darkness that lay within it and that he had carried with him through 2 deaths. Looking at her, holding her, watching her being held, if he could spend his whole life just doing that, then when next the gods called them to their side, he'd go happily. Unfortunately, he knew that was not to be his life, that while there would be mains such as those, there were other moments that needed to come first. So he set about to make those moments pass as quickly as possible, so that he could get back to the ones he wished. He'd had a night with them where the world was only that room. He now intended to spend but a day before he could get back to it. Jorah had told him that his and Dany's actions had been received well by the North, that no one thought them monsters or mentioned his grandfather, and instead it was his namesake and the field of fire that was spoken of. As for how they had welcomed his daughter, Jorah said they had feasted more her than they had the victory the night before. He told the man to get some sleep, and yet he'd not, and so he and Jaime set out on the day's work. Their first stop, a burned fool who'd tried to take on dragons. "Is he inside?" he asked the Maester. "He is, your grace. He's not long for this world." "Good," he said before moving into the room, Jaime following behind him. Malako lay on the bed, his body burned almost completely down one side, and he was a horrible sight to see. Turning to Jaime, he gave him leave to look away, though the knight refused, and Aegon then moved to sit at the bed beside the burned man. "You will die soon," he said simply. "I will see my daughter again." Malako coughed out. "She'll not welcome you how you think," he said to another cough. "My good sister, by all accounts, was a good woman. She made my brother happy, and trust me, I know better than most how shit this life can truly be. That she was able to make Robb feel joy, even if only for the briefest moment in time, is something that I'm grateful to her for. It cost her life," Malako spat. "Yet she died with the man she loved. Believe me, Malako, that is something all people in love wish for. In another world, she'd have lived. She'd have given birth to the child that grew in her belly," he said, and saw the way the man turned to him, realizing that he wasn't aware she was with child. "But this is the only world we have, and it'll be a far better one when you are gone from it." He rose to his feet and looked down at the man. He could ask him questions about Bellico and his plans, but he'd get no answers. The man was dying and knew it, and though he could make it more painful for him, it would do no use. "You've shamed her memory. I'll do my best to make the North know that their last true queen was a good woman and one I'd have been proud to name my kin. You, however, are soon to find out that death is not the peace you think it is. It's not the bliss you think that awaits you. Trust me, Malako, I've seen what is on the other side, and were I in your position then, I'd cling to every moment I could." Nodding to Jaime, they walked from the room and to the Maester who was waiting outside. Aegon looking at him and the Maester looking back nervously. "He's to be given nothing to dull the pain, no more treatments. That door is to remain open, and I want the keep to hear his screams before he dies," he said, and the Maester nodded. "Find me with some paper and ink. I have a raven I need you to send." Jaime looked at him as they walked, the knight seeming on the verge of saying something, and so Aegon decided to speak to him first. "You think that too harsh?" he asked, and Jaime shook his head. "No, your grace, you aren't torturing the man. You're letting him die and using it to your advantage. I think it clever," Jaime said. "It's been far too long being a northern fool, Sir Jaime, far too long." He met Ed, Tormund, Lady Magin, Lord Wyman as he moved through the keep, stopping and speaking to them and telling him what he had planned while accepting their good wishes for Daenjin, and congratulations, Oretta. Soon enough, he came to where Theon was being held and nodded to the guards to open the door. Theon, the man who'd been at one time the bane of his existence, a traitor, a turncloak, and who had also saved Sansa's life twice before coming to warn the North about her, seemed surprised to see him. "Am I to lose my head?" Theon asked. I exiled you, warned you what would happen if you came back. Yet, you came back. Why? He asked. She was lost, Jon. I tried. Gods, I tried. But she was lost, and what she wanted to do, I couldn't. If I'm to die, then so be it. But I couldn't do it again. Theon said, his voice as broken as the expression on his face. There is to be a trial, Theon. You'll need to speak on what you know about her. Can you? He asked. Jon, please. Can you speak of it? He asked more firmly, and saw Theon nod. I thank you for coming back, Theon. It doesn't erase all the bad, perhaps nothing can, but I told you on Dragonstone I can forgive you for what I can forgive you for. After the trial, you'll be taken to Seaguard and placed on a ship to the Iron Islands. Should you set foot in the north again, there won't be a third chance, he said, turning to move to the door. I hear you have a daughter now? Theon said, and Aegon smiled. I do, Rosia, he said. What you're to do with Sansa, Jon? Think of your daughter, Theon said softly. She and her mother are all I think about, he said as he reached the door, before he turned back to look at Theon once more. Should you find yourself in the Red Keep, you'll be welcomed, as you will, in any of the other kingdoms, Theon, he said, and saw him nod before Aegon, then left the room. He spent the next hour writing out the message to King's Landing and then speaking to the dragons, talking to them of their sister. Rosier told him that he'd protect her and make sure she grew to be the mighty dragon that she would one day be. Drogon giving him a look that pretty much mirrored his brother's. Logerix wished to see her more closely and, despite arguing with him, accepted that it would be on the morrow. Once he was sure they were all well, he made his way to the Great Hall and took the seat, and waited for Sansa to be brought in. The Trial of Sansa Stark, 305 AC. Lyanna Mormont. He'd asked her to be one of the judges, her and not her mother, and she knew it had not been meant as a snub. By rights, her mother was the Lady of Bear Island and the Warden of the North. Yet she and Aegon went further back than her mother, and he did, Aegon. That had come as a surprise to her when the letter had arrived, that Jon Snow was not Ned Stark's son, but her namesake's instead, had at first worried her. She could understand why he'd kept it to himself, his letter explaining that it was only when he'd come back to Winterfell that he'd known the truth, and that he had feared for his wife's safety. Given how Sansa Stark had acted when she thought him her brother, she could only imagine what she'd have done if she'd known he was actually her cousin. So she understood, and after speaking to her mother, she found it made no difference. He was her king. He remained her king, and she was proud to name him so. Lord Wyman and Edison Tollet were the other judges. Sansa would speak for herself, and Akin would speak against her, and she looked to see the still, arrogant look on Sansa Stark's face. That the queen wasn't here was understandable, and no one here would fault her for it. Lyanna finding she was looking forward to seeing the babe for herself once she could. She listened as Akin laid out the charges that with her own words, Sansa Stark had already proved herself guilty of, and yet even after the ones she expected, the charges kept coming. You are charged with treason by allying yourself with a foreign army and then trying to take the north by force. You are charged with treason by traveling to the Vale and trying to convince its noble lords to rise up and join you in an attempt to replace the rightful king and queen. You are charged with treason for traveling to the Riverlands in an attempt to do the same, and by sending messages even before you traveled there, seeking their aid and usurping the throne. You are charged with dereliction of your duty as Lady of Winterfell, for not sending word to little men of the north, informing them of the threat they faced, and the call to arms to face that threat. Aegon said, and she and everyone else looked at Sansa Stark and at the king. Is there more? Sansa said dismissively. You are charged with dereliction of your duty as Lady of Winterfell and acting Warden of the North for sending word to call men to arms while telling them to leave their families unprotected. Ogyan said to gasps, You are charged with treason for conspiring to usurp the king you swore to, while he was actively seeking allies, and finally, you are charged with willfully withholding the knowledge of the Knights of the Vale's march and keeping it to yourself before the Battle of the Bastards, resulting in the deaths of many men of the North and of Lord Rickon Stark, your own brother. How do you plead? Axid said, and she and the other judges looked on. Sansa Stark said nothing, and so Aegon began to lay out the case, Lyanna and the others listening on as he called Theon to confirm what was said in the Vale. Sansa now was suddenly willing to speak, and pointed out that the man knew only some of what was said. Aegon had Theon speak of what had happened at River Run, and again Sansa was able to twist some of what was said. When he spoke of Malakwo, there was far less said from her in dispute. Sansa's own words and actions were easily enough to confirm Theon's version of events. Then it came to speaking on the conspiring against the king, and though they all knew it was true, Sansa painted it in such a way that it wasn't exactly treason or close enough so that there could be some doubt. Rhaena watched as Aegon almost seemed to struggle to make his case at times. True enough, the events with Malakwo spoke for themselves, but she was surprised that he had charged Sansa with so much with so little proof. It was only when Lyanna saw him smirk and then wink when he looked at her that she realized it was all but a game and her king had come to play. Sansa. Her first instinct had been to call for a trial by combat, but then who could she call? Brienne may stand for her. Theon may, perhaps even Arya would, but none against Jon, and even if they did, they'd lose. She wasn't a fool. She doubted there was a warrior left in the world, and certainly not one in the realm that could beat Jon with a sword in hand. He could even, if he wished to, be just like his mad grandfather and name fire as his champion. Though in Jon's case, it would come in the form of the dragons rather than wildfire. No, a trial by combat couldn't work for her, so she needed to be smarter than he was. She needed to beat him with her mind, not with someone else's strength, and so she readied to do just that. Listening to the charges he laid out almost made her crumble. It was all of her greatest hits and worst failures. The Vale River Run, Malakwo, and the Battle of the Bastards. There were other things, too, which made no sense. What legio? Men. What did he mean, men? And not their families. There was room to work, though, even if she was shocked that Theon would testify against her. Yet another man, who she'd placed her faith in, and who in the end had let her down. She countered most of the claims, the Vale, the Riverlands. Theon hadn't seen it all, and so his version could not be counted on. Malakwo was a problem, but the man had helped her there too. His actions made her own understandable and explainable. Fear for her life would be her reasoning, and given what Malakwo had tried to do to her, that fear could be considered far more genuine than it truly was. There was hope, and given how Jon was floundering in laying out his case against her, even more than hope that she could win this, and then perhaps use it as proof of what she'd said all along. He was against her, against the North, and had used them both to get what he truly wanted. A dragon whore for a wife, and a bastard dragon spawn for a child. I call Sansa Stark to testify. Jon said, and she looked at him almost in glee. A fool he was, and had always been a fool. Reimagined Targaryen. He let her sweep away his arguments so that when he called her, she'd be as cocky and assured as he knew she still was. Despite all she'd done and how often her pathetic attempts to undermine him and Dany had failed, she was as arrogant as ever. Some people would be humbled. They'd seek forgiveness or recognize their own mistakes. Aegon found himself wondering, was her mother the same way? Did she argue right to the end that she was right in all she'd done? Or when death came for her, did she realize that had she but just done things differently, then her life would have gone how it did? In the end, perhaps it mattered not. You said that Theon wasn't aware of everything that was going on in the Vale, Lady Sansa, so while there you did not try to sway the Vale to your side, to fight for you against my wife and me, he asked. I did not, your grace. True enough, I tried to bring Lord Robert to my side, but that was not to go against your or her grace. That was simply because my own position was so perilous. I also, over time, developed feelings for my cousin. We were to be wed, and I'd have been more than happy to be the Lady of the Vale, and to swear its allegiance along with my husband, your grace. Indeed. Yet you were charged with Lord Robert's murder, were you not? He asked, and she glared at Theon as those in the room hushed. A false charge, your grace, and one that was proven so in the light of the gods. Sansa said, Yet a charge all the same, my lords, my ladies. I have a sworn letter here from the Lords of the Vale, who say that while Lady Sansa indeed won a trial by combat, it is without question that in their minds she killed Lord Robert. I also have more sworn letters confirming that despite denying it in this very room, Lady Sansa did indeed try to bring the Lords of the Vale to her side and have them rise up against myself and Queen Daenerys, even going so far as to blame us both for an attempt on her life, one where the true culprit was Cersei Lannister. Aegon said, and he heard the gasps and saw the crack appear on Sansa's facade. Lies! They hate me. I was the one conspired against. These are lies, Sansa shouted. Which brings me to Riverrun, Lady Sansa. You said that there, too, you didn't conspire against my wife and me. However, this raven written in your own hand seems to suggest otherwise. My lords, this was given to me by Lord Edmure Tully himself, Aegon said, to more shouts from Sansa. My uncle is a fool. He worried that I had a claim to River Run and the Riverlands, and so he sought to damn me with lies. Yes, most regrettable. Aegon said to some laughs. The Dreadfort, Lady Sansa, do you remember the message you sent to them? Perhaps I should read it out for the judges and the lords and ladies, he said, and she shook her head. Suffice to say, my lords, my ladies, that it too is written in Lady Sansa's hand, and it requests that only able-bodied men come to Winterfell. No wives, no children, no old or ill, only men who can fight. As for what was to come of those left behind, well, all of us here saw the dead. Aegon said, looking down to the ground. He heard the shouts and saw the worried look on Sansa's face. Aegon, finding that he had quite enjoyed putting that look there. Turning to the mountain clans, he nodded, and the wool moved forward. Aegon raising his hand to quieten down the room. Well, when her grace and I arrived to speak to you, we made mention of the raven, Lady Sansa said. Can you tell this court what you said to us? The Sansa sent no raven. The Jon, the wool said, and Aegon let it slide that he didn't use his true name. That would take time. Is this true, Lady Sansa? He asked with no reply. The Knights of the Vale, my lady, why didn't they ride with us into the Battle of the Bastards? He asked and saw her gulp. What? Is it not true that you knew of them even as we marched? That you and the late Lord Baxley were in contact, and you had known of their presence at Moat Cailin, even while we sought men to take Winterfell back from the Boltons? That on the very eve of battle, when we spoke and I told you that we hadn't the men, that the fight we were going into was one that we may very lose and that my brother may very well lose his life. Is it not true you not only kept the truth about the Knights of the Vale to yourself, but told me that my brother's life was forfeit? Aegon said. He didn't wish to name Rickon as their brother because the woman he spoke to was not his kin. Ramsay, he'd have never. Rickon, we had to win, he had to pay, she said, shaking. And for once it was with genuine emotion and not the mummery he'd come to expect. Yet you kept the knowledge of them to yourself. Even as we lined up to face the far larger force, even as good men and women of the North and true North marched and fell, you kept it to yourself, and the Knights of the Vale only rode when Rickon fell, and when it looked as if I too had fallen, he said to gasps, as those who were there and who'd seen the battle beller that day. I sent them, they saved, were it not for, the words were jumbled as she tried to explain. What was it you said to my sister, Lady Sansa? Should I speak the words, or will you? Her tears fell, and though he believed them to be true, he couldn't be certain. You should be on your knees thanking me. We're standing in Winterfell because of me. You didn't win it back, Jon didn't win it back, he lost the Battle of the Bastards. The Knights of the Vale won the battle, and they rode north for me, Aegon said, and men rose, women shouted. Even Lyanna Mormont jumped up from her seat. He waited for them to quieten down, and he looked at Sansa, whose eyes were moving from side to side, looking for a way out. Do you remember what else was discussed between you and my sister, my true sister, and not whatever it is you claim to be? Aegon said bitterly, Jon, please. My name is Aegon Targaryen. Jon Snow is dead. Remember that, Lady Stark, Jon said as he held up the raven scroll that Arya had given him. Sansa's words, written out clearly. Robb, I write to you today with a heavy heart. Our good King Robert is dead, killed from wounds he took in a boar hunt. Father has been charged with treason. He conspired with Robert's brothers against my beloved Joffrey and tried to steal his throne. The Lannisters are treating me well and providing me with every comfort. I beg you, come to King's Landing and swear fealty to King Joffrey and prevent any strife between the great houses of Lannister and Stark. Your faithful sister, Sansa. She shrank down in her seat as the shouts rang around the great hall. Aegon looking to the back of it to see Brienne, Jorah, and Dany holding Rhaella and standing in between them. With a nod, his wife turned and walked back to their room, and Aegon once again quietened down those who were baying for Sansa's blood. My lords, my ladies, I'll not speak more about Mallico and Lady Sansa's alliance with him. You were there, you heard the words she spoke, which proved her as true as these words written in her own hand. I'll say no more, for there is little I can say, other than to ask of you, what say you? Guilty, Ed said loudly. Guilty. Wyman said with a look of disgust on his face. Guilty, Lyanna Mormont said, her lips in a snarl. Lady Sansa, you have been found guilty by this court. Do you have anything to say? He asked, and she said nothing. Instead, she was almost curled into a ball, her body shrinking in on itself. Then, in the name of her Grace Queen Daenerys and in my own name, King Aegon Targaryen, you are hereby sentenced to death. May the gods grant you mercy. He said no more, and nodded to the guards to take her away. He actually quickly moving through the large doors and making his way down to his room. Jaime walked behind him, and Aegon was glad of the silence, as he was when he entered the door and saw Dany and Rhaella on the bed. Taking off his sword and his gambeson, he was soon standing there in just a shirt and his breeches, and then he moved to the bed. He kissed Dany and looked down on his sleeping daughter. Guilty? Jaime asked. What now? Now she'll pay, he said simply, as he rubbed his finger over Rhaella's cheek.